Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the 6th annual SANRC FYE conference. In the few minutes that we have before we commence with our first workshop presentation of the day, it's a workshop heavy day, I thought that I would share something that is quite meaningful. It's a poem that is often circulated by our colleagues and our friends in the first year experience community. It's author unknown, I might add. And it's quite a long poem. I'll just read part of it. And if you like, you can share reactions below. The poem is called, "Why Am I in College?" A question I get asked by my professors, my advisor, my roommate, and even my friends. Even though I know how important it is to have an answer to ensure my college success, I don't have one, and it hurts. I take the career tests, the personality tests, the interest inventories, I attend career workshops, not much help with the answer, and I get more confused. At this point, why should I even bother to be here when I don't know what I really want to do? How do I decide? Who should I go talk to? Should I listen to my parents, my friends, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, my pastor? Should I just pick something that will get me a job? You tell me, go to career services, go to your advisor, take a class. All that will tell you what to do. Nope. They haven't helped at all. So, why am I in college? I want to succeed. I want to grow. I want a reason to be alive. How can you help me? You help me with my classes. You help me with my schedule. But that's not what I need. Help me to find my purpose, my passions, my dreams. Help me to find a way to make a difference to others. Help me minimize my fears, my obstacles. Help me get around the brick walls that stand in my way. Help me find a path that's aligned with my heart and my soul. Help me to understand there's more to life than just getting a piece of paper and a job after graduation. Give me a reason to be here and to stay here. Help me to see the value of this whole experience. If you can help me, here's my promise to you. I will serve and contribute my best to the world. I will take responsibility for all my actions and my decisions, and I will live a life full of abundance and joy. Support and encourage me, and then I will be able to answer the question, why am I in college? I thought that message was worth sharing this morning, particularly at this time of great uncertainty in the higher education sector. And also when some of us start to re-examine, perhaps question our roles, our impact in the system, and ultimately try to understand what is our legacy. I hope that resonated with you. I did think the message of this poem was something that was indeed worth sharing this morning. And yes, I hope that this can sit with you as we go along on our journey this morning. So, moving swiftly ahead, I would like to introduce our first workshop presenter for the day, Ms. Sheila Drew from SADI, the South African Institute for Distance Education. Sheila is program specialist for ECD at SADI. Now, she's worked all over South Africa and in different parts of Africa doing program and curriculum design, material design and development, and working on open educational resources. Now, this workshop is all about the big issue of our times, online teaching and learning. And Sheila is going to be helping us try to figure out how to make the transition to what she calls quality online teaching and learning. Now, this workshop is participatory. It's meant to stimulate a lot of deep reflection. So I hope that you will take full advantage of it and participate as fully as you can. Sheila?
Good morning, everybody. I hope you haven't set me up so that people expect too much, Ancilla. So, thank you for the introduction. I do hope that this will be a participatory and an engaging workshop. It was billed as, or I was told it was, professional development. And I think, well, I hope you'll learn something from it. I don't presume to know all the answers. I think, like everybody, we've been exploring ideas that we thought were good, useful, and in some ways have been turned on their heads. And so I think everybody's doing a lot of rethinking together, and I hope this morning will be the same. I'm not trying to provide answers. In fact, there'll be a lot of opportunity for you to reflect and think for yourself. Hopefully there'll be opportunities for you to share with others, but I'll walk you through that process. So I just need to check before I start. I'm going to be sharing my screen. And part of what we're going to be doing this morning is, as far as possible, in a group like this, in a group online, interacting with each other through a series of activities. And one of the ways in which we're going to interact with each other is through the chat. I'll be using the chat in a slightly different way this morning. Well, perhaps not for some of you. At different points along the way, I'll be posting links into the chat, which you'll be able to click on, and then I'll be able to share what you're doing in that link on my screen. So I need to be sure that while I'm presenting, you can all see the chat and interact with the chat. So perhaps if you're able to, and Silla, I don't know if you're going to be keeping an eye on the chat for me.
Will do.
But if you're able to react with a thumbs up that you can see the chat, that you know how to use the chat, and that you are able to engage in the chat. I see a couple of thumbs up. How many thumbs up do we have, Ancilla? Good.
I am looking, how do I see the number of thumbs up?
On the participant list?
Oh,
yeah.
Yes. Okay, so we have a number of them. I just have to quickly scroll down. I think we have about 5.
Okay, so part of what we're trying to do, the thumbs are slow, that's okay. I'll try and move at a pace that accommodates everybody. But remember that your choice is to participate on your own terms. My job is to persuade you to participate. If you don't, it's probably a reflection on me. And I accept that as a teacher, because that's my role, is to engage you. Anyway, so let's give it a go. So I'm going to be talking about a course that Sadie developed over the last few months, which we hope will be useful in trying to help people to transition to online teaching and learning. So that would be probably important for a first-year student who might not have studied online before. It might be important even for second and third and fourth-year students. And there might be some teachers or lecturers or facilitators for whom it's also important because it might be their first time teaching online. But actually, the intention is that it's not just for first time or first year. It's for any time. Because I want to try and share some of the key principles with you that apply not just to first time, but to every time, and not just to online, but also to face-to-face, to any kind of meaningful and engaging teaching and learning. So what I've done is I've taken aspects of the course that we've developed. We've called it COTL, Quality Online Teaching and Learning. We South African, we like to make up these acronyms. And if you would like to, I'm going to post the link to the course in the chat now. And if you'd like to, and if you're able, and if it's not going to be a distraction for you, then please feel free to go there and explore it. If you're not able to do that now, then copy the link and save it somewhere, and you'll be able to go onto the course at any time after this. It's a free, open course that you can use. You can download the original Word document. You can adapt it for yourself and use it. So this course is targeted at lecturers, teachers, facilitators, whatever we want to call ourselves. I've adapted it for today, and I've added in bits which I wouldn't normally, which are not necessarily in the course itself, because the course is aimed at low bandwidth environments, and some of the things that I've added in rely on online because we are online today. So the structure of the course and the structure of the journey we're going to do today is there up on screen. It's structured in 5 units, and those 5 units are structured around a framework that Sadie uses for design and for review. And it's around 5 key questions. Where do we start? What do students need to learn? How do we support students to succeed? How will we know students have learned? And how can we ensure quality teaching and learning? I'll touch on 1 or 2 of the questions in a little more detail than others, but nonetheless, that's the structure that we will follow. Okay, so where do we start? Well, this morning we start with you. Who are you? What is your experience? And I've devised a little poll, which I'd like you to do, just to give a sense of your experience of online learning. You'll be able to answer more than once to each of 2 questions. And then we'll look at the results of the poll together. So I'm going to launch the poll now, and you should be able to see it on your screens. And if you'll just answer question 1 and question 2, and you can choose more than one option. Are you all able to see it?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
And are you able to vote? Right. A lot of you are saying that during the pandemic, you've learned how to design collaborative online activity-based learning. Most of you, or some of you, have always put your PowerPoint lecture notes online.
There's a question, Sheila. Once you submit the poll, can you submit more answers?
Once you've done it, I will be able to see it, but if I relaunch the poll, you'll lose the answers. Palesa, am I correct?
No, you are able to share the results once the poll is done.
Yes, but can someone answer? Can someone go back and answer?
No.
Okay. Colleen, you couldn't select more than one option. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had set it up to be a multiple choice. Okay. Most of you have voted. Let me give you another minute. So what's interesting also is that most of you expect your students to read and discuss in your classes.
Okay.
Can you see the results there?
Yes.
Okay. So 25% of you have always put your lecture notes online. Before March, not many of you had never used the online platform. So from that, I gather that you do have some experience of online. 55% of you say that you have learned about putting activity-based collaborative materials online as a result of the pandemic. None of you ask students just to do reading, which I think is a good sign, that there's always at least some discussion with it. And none of you have invited students to be part of group projects. And I understand that that's a challenge because of the new online environment. Hopefully we can explore new ways of doing that. I know that yesterday there was a session on assessment, which I found very interesting, about how to design assessments that are not just a once-off test, but also involve collaborating with other students. Okay, so thank you. I've got a sense of where you are, and who you are, and where you're coming from. The other thing that we're going to look at in a little bit of detail is a resource that we've got on the course. If you were able to go into the course with the link that I gave you, you could go to Unit 1, Activity 1.1, and download the design tool. Don't worry if you can't, because we'll work a little bit with it during this session. It looks something like that. And it's also based on the 5 key questions on the left-hand side. And then there are some elements and criteria that accompany each question. In the right-hand column, this tool gives you the opportunity to reflect on these criteria, think about how you can implement them, but also add your own new criteria. So in a way, what we're encouraging you to do is to think about your own design and teaching and learning processes and decide for yourself what constitutes quality. Obviously, these elements and criteria, we think, go some way to defining what we understand by quality. So that's a tool that you can use to guide your design process. The other thing that the course does is relies quite heavily on WhatsApp. And I see there's a post in the chat that's asked that where you're asking students to use WhatsApp for some of your group interactions. So the course that I'm pointing you to uses WhatsApp as a way of communicating collaboratively in a study group. And in fact, if you know someone or more people on this conference and you have their WhatsApp numbers, why don't you form a group now? And then as we work through this session, maybe you'll find an opportunity to share in your WhatsApp group some of your reflections with the little group that you set up now. If you're not able to do that, that's fine. We can use the chat as a way of collaborating and communicating with each other. Okay. So what we've essentially just done is an orientation. So we started with getting to know who we are, providing some sort of structure that's going to be becoming a little bit familiar with activity-based learning. We practiced, hopefully, some navigation skills, some copying and pasting and cutting and pasting. I've shared a tool with you and an opportunity to create a WhatsApp group for collaboration. And hopefully, we feel a little more secure and confident to proceed. So an important part of the first question, where do we start, is an orientation for students. So hopefully we've achieved that to some extent in this first little session. So what we're going to do next is an activity that focuses on understanding your students' personal context in an online environment. Because we believe that understanding your students' context will increase their ability to succeed. It will increase their ability to navigate, to find their way, to feel part of a group, and to continue their journey, and perhaps get a little bit closer to knowing why they're at college. But it will also help your ability to provide quality online learning, quality learning. Because the more you understand your students, the more you're able to accommodate their needs. Okay, so in your own mind, think about who your students are, their context. This is an example of a tool that we call the Student Profile Tool. You can get it from the course and you can fill it in for your own context. In this example, we were reflecting about the student's access to the internet, and we understand that in very many cases, students have had to go home, there's very poor bandwidth. And the implication of that is that synchronous sessions are very, very difficult. In other words, students don't have access to connectivity, they don't have access to data. So what do we do about that in order to support them through this learning? We might need to provide data. We might need to provide tablets. But in our design, we know that we should not emphasize synchronous online learning because students may have access to the internet at certain times, which lends itself much more suitably for asynchronous activities. Their experience in online, it's possible, certainly with first-year students, that they've never studied online before. And so, as I did in this session, we need to allow for time and for the opportunity for students to orientate themselves to the new learning environment. And we need to support and guide them in that. Okay. I thought it would be useful to give you an opportunity to think about your students' context. So I'd like for us to do another poll. And to do that, I go to, no. How do I get to the, sorry, to the other poll? Here we are. Here's the context poll. So here there's just one question, but you're thinking about your students' context and their experience of online learning. So go ahead and start the poll. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so mostly students seem to get their notes online and interact in WhatsApp groups. Some students do online assessments only. Some students use their textbooks because they don't have data or connectivity. About a third of students engage in the online collaborative activities on your LMSs. And a lot of students are sometimes offline and sometimes online when they can connect. So there, that idea of synchronous and asynchronous is coming up again. And we'll generally find that that's an important consideration in the materials that you design for online learning. And WhatsApp groups do seem to be a very common feature. I think it's probably a relatively new thing, although I do know that there were students that were interacting on WhatsApp before the pandemic. But perhaps what we should spend some of our time thinking about is how can we use WhatsApp in more creative ways, not just as a chat forum, but perhaps as a forum to share videos, to share documents that students have produced, and so on. Okay, I'll give you a couple more seconds. But the percentages don't seem to be changing much. Okay, so these are the results. 45% of students get their notes online and interact in WhatsApp groups. A quarter of students do online assessments only. I wonder if that means that students study offline and only do their assessments online, which is an interesting thing to consider. Students use their textbooks because they don't have data or connectivity. And I think we would need to ask ourselves, to what extent do those textbooks support students in learning, or just provide them with information that we still need to support them to mediate or interpret in the ways that we want them to engage with it. Students engage in online collaborative activities. That's encouraging. A third of students do that. And most students are generally offline and sometimes online when they can connect. Okay, so the idea really is for you to spend time in your design process trying to understand who your students are and what the implications of that are for the materials that you're providing to students. Okay. We found this bandwidth immediacy matrix of Daniel Stanford's quite useful to think about low bandwidth environments and what he calls immediacy. In other words, it's essentially about synchronous and asynchronous. You'll be able to find the link in the course. I hope you can see that matrix well enough.
Yes.
Effectively, he starts off in a green matrix, which is about readings with text and images, emails, discussion boards with text and images. And on the two axes, that's on a low bandwidth, which is your horizontal axis, and low immediacy, which is your vertical axis. If you move to the blue quadrant, you're able to start working more collaboratively with documents, chatting, and messaging, because there's a higher bandwidth, but it's still quite low immediacy.
Sheila, there's a request to put the link in the chat.
I haven't prepared all the links in the course for you. So it's going to be a bit of a mission for me to go and find it right now.
No, you can share it later, I'm sure.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Then if we move up again, higher bandwidth and higher immediacy, we've got video conferences and audio conferences. But in between that, we've got pre-recorded audio, pre-recorded video, asynchronous discussions, perhaps with the video, and asynchronous discussions, perhaps with an audio. He prefers in a low bandwidth, low immediacy environment. In other words, an environment that is more like the one we have right now, to try and make use of those applications in the green block. And so we need to challenge ourselves to think about how can we use readings with text, readings with images, emails, perhaps WhatsApp falls into the green band, or maybe it's the blue. But the idea is, thank you, Carlene. The idea, that's collaboration for you. The idea is to look at this matrix and reflect on your own context and think about which context suits your, which of these applications suit your context best. So here's a self-reflection, and perhaps just take a minute, 30 seconds or a minute, to look at these self-reflection questions. What have you already put in place to support your students in low-tech or low-bandwidth environments? What technology and resources are accessible to you and your students in this context now? Which zone do you think is best for giving students maximum access, given their context? How does your current course or program or courses take account of your students' context and needs? Not just from a point of view of bandwidth. What are their other needs? Going back to your student profile. What changes do you need to make to accommodate your students' access to learning, technology, and resources? And there's the matrix, just to remind you. I'll give you a minute or half to think about some of those questions. If you've managed to set up a WhatsApp group, you might want to share a reflection in your WhatsApp group, or you might want to share in the chat one or two thoughts about those questions.
Sheila, I just wonder, do you want to invite any raised hands so that people can share live? Perhaps we could give them a minute or two.
If people would like to do that.
Hi, I can't
So
find
there's
my hand thingy, but I can talk.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I do screen recordings all the time. I do like little mini tutorials, even things that we take for granted, like how to start up something, how to think about something, how to align an activity, even outside of the content, just how to be grounded, gather yourself, get into a position where you can learn, especially coming from off the back of COVID, where students are really overwhelmed. They're dealing with things that in a regular academic season wouldn't necessarily be as prominent. And thereby, I'm not saying that COVID has introduced necessarily a whole range of items, but COVID has really amplified existing concerns that they were already dealing with, and then they're on top of stuff. So in terms of how to support them, especially for low-tech environments or low bandwidth, we do much shorter sessions. We forward a lot more material that they can use extracurricularly outside of academic content, just to be and feel well, and then start learning. And we encourage them to respond to that and say in what ways it helped them, even if it's out of the ordinary well-being tools. And then, yeah, in terms of current context, we've met after hours with quite a few students who had to take on extra jobs and couldn't meet during regular office hours. So I've got set times on Calendly where they can book a spot, and they can choose a time that fits with them as well. So we've accommodated them in ways that I think necessarily wouldn't have fit into a regular day-to-day going about business type of thing. So yeah, that's just my thoughts on that.
Thank you, Colleen.
There's a comment on the chat from Welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome, would you like to be live, or shall I read out your comment? Welcome says, as an institution to assist students with the issue of saving data, audio recorded sessions and short videos are encouraged. Minimization of live sessions. That's interesting.
So we can see that in the matrix there. So it's pre-recorded audio, pre-recorded video is much more supportive in a low bandwidth environment. And synchronous sessions are discouraged because it's difficult for students to be, not just to be online all the time, but online with a lot of people at the same time. Okay, thank you. So hopefully that's something that you can consider. So let's think about some of the ways in which we can support students. Sorry, I'm not that right. Here we go. So now there's another poll. And I think to some extent we might have already thought of some of these, but just think about, in addition to other materials, how do you support your students? Chat forums, summaries, annotated readings, private WhatsApp messages, emails, WhatsApp groups. And if there are other ideas, you could post those in the chat too.
There's also a comment from Andre on the chat. We have also investigated a tool that integrates our learning management system with WhatsApp. I don't know the detail.
Very interesting. I know that there is a WhatsApp app that you can use on your desktop. I wonder if it's a similar thing. So you've got some interest there, Andre. And Carlene, you say the desktop app works well?
Let me just get a bit more information, Sheila, and then I will maybe type the name of the product in here. I'm not endorsing it specifically because we've only investigating it, but at least I can give the people at the conference the name of the app. Or not the app,
the tool.
That would be fantastic. Thank you, Andre. Okay, so it looks like mostly, I'll end the polling now. It looks like mostly we rely on WhatsApp groups and emails. Private WhatsApp messages, I suppose that would be if you notice that a student is not participating particularly well, or if they're messaging you that they're having a challenge, then private WhatsApp messages could be useful. Annotated readings, I think that comes to a different aspect of students' needs, which is often raised, which is about the challenges of language and the challenges of moving into a new environment in which we might find a new kind of language, an academic language, or a discipline-specific language, that students might struggle with some of the readings that we provide them because they're academic readings and they're not used to that kind of reading and they're not used to that level of reading. And annotated readings can be particularly useful in supporting students to come to know the new language and also to come to know how to read that kind of text. Summaries, I think, are particularly useful. They give opportunity to pause, to stop and think, and to check whether what the summary is telling me I should have learned or read or heard, I actually have. And if I haven't, I'm able to cross-check myself. And in a way, it's almost like a form of self-assessment. So summaries, I think, are particularly supportive. And then chat forums, a bit like we're using now, but on your LMS. A chat forum can be a nice asynchronous way of engaging students, particularly if you as the lecturer are following the chat forum and every now and then you insert a summary of where the chat has taken the students, or even challenge an opinion that might have been posted in a chat forum. Andrea, you say the product is called Connect Yard. Thank you very much. And it's certainly, Himali, it certainly integrates with Blackboard. You're not sure about the other LMSs. Great. Thank you for that. Okay. So basically the feedback from this little activity that we've just done, hopefully we've seen there's some feedback about an app. We've shared ideas about the ways in which we support students through technology. But we've also seen that a contextual understanding of students will help in knowing what kind of support we need to build in to our learning design. That there are barriers to participation and to success, and we need to find ways, not just through technology, but other ways as well in our learning design to help students overcome those barriers. We need to find a balance of working synchronously and asynchronously, because synchronous expectations are certainly a barrier. But we also need to find ways of including student voices and using communication strategies to include students in that collaborative process. Okay, so on to the second question of the framework. What do students need to learn? It's an ambiguous question. On the one hand, it could say, what do students need to learn? In other words, the content. But it could also be asking the question, what do students need in order to learn. And that's more about the process. And we believe that the answer to that is about the kind of methodology or the pedagogical process that we design into the learning. Sorry. And so what we're going to focus on for the next little while is an approach to activity-based learning that we think is important. You might have noticed in the activity that we did that there was a structure to the activity. And this is a template that we use in all our design, which helps us to remember that every activity needs a purpose. Every activity relies on access to resources, whatever those might be, whether it's a pre-recorded video, whether it's a WhatsApp platform, whether it's a reading, an annotated reading. And every activity obviously has a task. And that task needs to be made clear and explicit to students. If you don't make the task clear, that in itself can become a barrier to students' participation in the activity. Once you've done the task, there's an opportunity for students to reflect, to share with each other, and to respond to what other students have shared. And this is an important part of the activity which helps to create a sense of community and a sense of belonging and a sense of agency among students. So you'll be asking them to do things like reflect, revisit, think, post, comment, share, in whichever way they can. So it might be in a WhatsApp platform, it might be in an email, it might be on a chat, asynchronously on an LMS, it might be synchronously, verbally on an LMS if we have that opportunity. But a final important opportunity is to give and receive feedback on what I've done in this activity. So I might get some feedback from my peers, and that helps me to think again about something that I thought previously. I might get feedback from my teacher, from a more knowledgeable other, that corrects something that I might have thought previously, or challenges, or reaffirms something that I've learned in the activity. And so there's a constant presence of me and my peers and me and my teacher through that reflection, sharing, responding, and giving and receiving feedback. And in fact, you've just done that cycle in the activity that we did. We've reflected this in what we call a learning cycle, and it's probably familiar to many of you. Do, act, think, act, review. There's different variations of it. But we think it reflects how humans learn best in activity-based learning. And so we've got, for example, bottom left, content to frame an activity. That might be a reading that gives some content. It might be a lecture that provides a context for an activity, a learning activity that you want students to do. And that activity could be reading, it could be creating a product, it could be analyzing, it could be thinking, it could be summarizing. There's a guided reflection, that response, share, get feedback. But in addition to that, there's a conscious effort to guide students' reflection from a teacher or a more knowledgeable other. And that helps to consolidate the ideas that have been raised in the activity. And importantly, I spoke about summaries earlier, importantly to summarize and help students to move on. So through the activity, we might have gained new ideas. We've thought about those ideas, and now we're moving on with those new ideas or that new knowledge along a pathway to another activity that helps to consolidate or challenge or guide our thinking along a pathway through the design that we've created for students. And through this kind of activity-based design and support, we're able to create presence. We're able to create a social presence among students, a teacher presence between teachers and between teachers and students. And importantly, we're also able to create a cognitive presence because it helps us to think about where do we want students to be on their learning journey and what kinds of thinking do we want them to be doing in the activities that we're providing. It also helps to promote collaboration because through those learning activities, we can devise ways of getting students to work together and to share together with each other and give each other feedback. Okay. So while you're reflecting on that little diagram, I'm going to post in the chat another link. And this is a link to a Padlet. I don't know if any of you have used a Padlet before. I think it's quite a nice little tool. It is an online tool. It's one of the tools that I've added because I know that this is an online environment. I'd like you to click on that link, and what you will find is a Padlet called Social Presence. And I'm going to share that if you go and click on it, what I'd like you to do is anywhere in that Padlet, you can double click, or you can go to the bottom right corner where there's a red add button and just post a word or a phrase that you think means social presence or is associated with social presence. You should be able to see on my shared screen people adding in. So can you see that shared screen? So you might have to switch between two of your screens. So what we've got so far is awareness, motivation, effective communication, engaged, visibility, exciting engagement, names, soul making. If you're not managing to contribute to this Padlet, don't panic. There's two more. With practice, you'll get it right. Enthusiasm, friendship, enthusiastic engagement, connection. I wonder, by connection, do you mean internet connection or do you mean human connection? Rapport, lively discussion. Okay, we're getting some nice contributions here. Collective. Human connection. Thank you for the clarity. Okay, I'll give you a couple more seconds and then we'll close this Padlet. Enhanced communication. Motivating. Flow. Debate. There's some wonderful ideas here. Okay, so that's the idea of social presence. And I think it's come up often in some of the discussions yesterday even. The need to help students to feel connected with each other, to belong, to be part of a community, as a way of supporting each other. It's not only us who are able to support students, they can support each other. I think yesterday in one of the sessions, people were talking about how surprising it was, how resilient students are actually, and their ability to support each other and to support themselves. But that also that connection with each other is motivating to keep going, to persevere in difficult circumstances. It's rewarding. Someone has posted here, rewarding learning. That you're not just alone, thinking, reading, getting frustrated, not sure if you're learning the right stuff. You're able to interact and get the reward of that. The feedback is a reward in itself. Even if your idea wasn't quite right, the fact that you're getting feedback is a reward because you're able to change and challenge yourself. Okay. I'm going to close that Padlet. Well, actually, I don't have to, but I'll leave it open. You can come back and contribute if you want to. But what I want to do now is to open a new Padlet. I want you to go to another Padlet, which is about a teacher presence. So let's see if we can copy a new link in the chat. So here's a new link in the chat. Go to the new link and you'll be able to see teacher presence. And let's try and do the same thing. Type in words that for you are associated with a teacher presence. Mindfulness. Empathy. Welcome. What you can do is you just go to padlet.com. You can use the free version. You're limited to the number of Padlets you can create, but it's really user-friendly and a very nice tool. Mike, I see in the Zoom chat, you're saying courageous, empathy. In the Padlet, we're seeing compassionate, aware of students, guidance, understanding, self and other awareness, flexibility. Remember, it's teaching and learning, not just teaching. Supportive, ethics of care, aware of students. Pioneer, wonderful words. And what this means is, perhaps for some of us, we're starting to rethink who we are as teachers. What does it mean to be a teacher? I'm not just delivering content. I'm not just a more knowledgeable other. I'm actually sharing that knowledge, and I'm taking responsibility for making sure that what I share is understood. or is engaged with in some kind of way. Self-directed learning, that's an interesting one. So I am my own teacher, but I'm my own teacher not as an island. I'm my own teacher in a community with other people. Wonderful. And then we're going to do a third one. And again, I'm going to post a third link. And this will take us to a Padlet which asks us to think about cognitive presence. Sorry, here we go. A cognitive presence. So again, think about what words do you associate with a cognitive presence in teaching and learning? Mindfulness, the same as a teaching presence. Would mindfulness also apply to a social presence? Skills. So it's not just about thinking, it's also about skills. How do I use my thinking in order to do application? Critical thinking. There's not only one way of thinking. Integration of what? Reflective thinking. Cognition is not just about being able to think about what I've done. It's to think about what I know. It's also to think about what I've done. Integration of knowledge and application, theory, practice. We all know that debate. Interpreting, problem solving, adaptability, mobilizing. I wonder what mobilizing means. Flow of ideas. We've got some overlaps here with social presence. In social presence, we also had the word flow. Mobilizing, getting ahas, reasoning, shifting into something doable. Is there a word that helps us to think about the relationship between social presence, teacher presence, and cognitive presence? Or are they all separate things? Assimilating, coherence, differentiation. How do we differentiate the way in which we design a program or design an activity that can accommodate different students' needs? Crystallization. Contextualizing. Right. Inclusivity. Thank you. Person after my heart. We've got some wonderful ideas. Okay, so let's come back to, you can go to that link at any time, by the way, and you'll be able to add to it and see what other people have added. Universal design for learning. Thank you. A good way to stop the share. Okay. So effectively what we're trying to promote is the idea that in order to support students, you need to create all three of these presences in whatever teaching and learning you engage with students. And obviously there's different ways of doing that. But that's what we need to have in the back of our minds all the time. So just to summarize, social presence, the biggest danger in distance education is isolation. And actually, we run the danger of creating spaces which become prohibitive unless we understand where our students are coming from and what their context is. We understand that learning is collaborative and it's a social activity of constructing knowledge. And in order to do that, we need to try and bridge the separation between teachers and students. So in fact, although we want to create a teacher presence, we are part of the social presence. What we have to find a balance of is how do we be part of that social presence without becoming intrusive and being really clear on what our role is. And how do we maximize dialogue and conversation with other humans, other more knowledgeable humans, in a way that's collaborative? And how do we influence what students know, what they think, the direction that they take, that learning pathway that we saw in that learning cycle? Our role is to help students to move along that pathway in a way that's supported and scaffolded, in a way that helps them to come to know something and be able to apply that thing. So we are essentially a mediator, creating an environment that encourages reflection, that builds community, that stimulates and guides, and that supports students' knowledge and thinking. And the cognitive presence applying to any learning environment, not just an online learning environment, where we as the teacher support students in conditions which encourage mental action, that students are able to engage in developmental learning activities that promote critical thinking, and that they are in a position to process information, think critically, and reflect on new knowledge that they have constructed and assimilated in the process. Okay. Let's take this one step further. And that is to think about that learning cycle that we saw earlier, and try and think about, so I'm going to post another link. Sorry, I'm slightly distracted. We're going to another Padlet, and in this Padlet, we're going to think about where in that learning cycle can we see the different presences. So, for example, you might think that there's a teacher presence in the first step of the cycle, which is content to frame the activity. So you might decide there's a teacher presence there. Where would you place social presence or cognitive presence? And you might have different ideas, and you might place them in more than one place. You're able to see my screen? Yes? Are you getting to the link? So someone brave enough to add a post somewhere in the cycle where we have cognitive presence. Ah, there we go. If you right-click on your post, you can color it. So I'm calling teacher presence pink, social presence yellow, cognitive presence green. And you can move your post around. So someone is suggesting that in the guided reflection, there's a social presence and a cognitive presence. You might disagree. You can disagree in the chat, or you can take someone else's. No, can you? I don't know if you can take someone else's and move it for them. That would be a bit cheeky. I'm starting to keep my eye on the time. I've got till 10:30, right, Ancilla?
Yes, 15 minutes left.
Maybe if I stop short, it'll be a tease for you to come and do the course. Self-study course. Anyone else? All three presences in the guided reflection. Now, what color am I supposed to make that? Right. Cognitive presence in the guided reflection. Cognitive presence in along the learning pathway. In other words, all the time. Any other places where social presence? Is there no social presence in the learning activity itself? There might not be if you're studying alone. A teacher presence, is that intended to be at the new activity, or is it intended to be on the learning pathway? Teacher presence in the new activity or the learning pathway? Is there any social presence at the beginning of the cycle, content to frame activity? What about this idea that we want to try and understand what students already know? And part of engaging in the community is coming to know what do they already know. And that could be part of the content that frames your activity. So I would argue that there could be a social presence at that point in the cycle where we're giving content to frame the activity. Social presence at the new activity. So I am starting to see that, well, there's one suggestion that all three presences are part of the guided reflection. What we can certainly see is that all three presences are somewhere along that learning pathway. And I think the point is that we need to be thinking at all times, what can we do to create those three presences? When I'm providing content to frame the activity, surely I need to draw on what students already know. I need to be providing my own insights and opinions into that content. As part of the learning activity, students might learn together, they might learn alone. But if we follow the idea of sharing, responding, feedback, then hopefully that will contribute to a social community. And when we design the learning activities themselves, we need to think about what kind of thinking are we asking students to do? We don't just want recall. Some of you might refer to the Bloom's taxonomy. Some of you might use Fink's taxonomy, which is more about kind of broader domains of learning. And in any case, we need to be thinking about how we want students to think. Critical thinking, mindful thinking, reflective thinking. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing there. Danielle, you've said a continuum of presences, not mutually exclusive instances of them. Would you like to talk to that briefly?
Danny?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button. Sorry, colleagues. Thank you, Sheila. No, just hearing you talk and seeing where people are posting on the Padlet in terms of presences. I mean, I think one could argue that perhaps at every step along the way, there is actually all three presences, but to varying degrees. And that's basically what I mean by a continuum. Your point about right at the beginning, your question about the social presence. I mean, yes, there is a social presence there, but it might not be quite as strong of a social presence as another point along the learning journey, for example. So I don't disagree with anything that's been said, but I certainly feel that all three are present along that entire learning journey, and it's just a case of which one is slightly more pronounced than or more pronounced than another one at any point.
Thanks, Danielle. I think you're probably right, and it probably also is in part determined by the kind of activity that you're wanting students to engage in. It might be determined by the topic. Some topics might lend themselves more to working together in a particular activity. Other topics might be less conducive to that kind of community. And really the point is just for us as designers to be mindful of the fact that we need all three presences to varying degrees at different times in any quality learning and teaching environment. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to start moving a little more quickly. We are on to our fourth question. How will we know students have learned? In the course, and certainly for this session, there's quite a strong focus on formative assessment. I think in part because I think it's a neglected area. I think the value of it is understated, but also because maybe we found in this new environment that summative assessment is a little more tricky. How do you set an online exam? Once off, is it really testing what students have learned to this point? I want to do the last poll. And this poll is asking 3 questions, and it's true or false. So it's your opinion about 3 questions. Let's see how we go. Couple more seconds. I'm glad to see we've got a contentious question in number 2. And a little bit contentious in number 3. All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to end the polling, partly because I'm running out of time. And these are the results. So half of you responded. That's the first important thing to note. Not everybody responded to the poll, but those who did respond agreed that formative assessments provide support for learning and teaching. So That's a good start. Most of you said that an example of a summative assessment is a final version of a paper that a student has written over a period of time with review and feedback from a teacher. But some of you said that that's not the case. We'll come back to that. And then the last question, students do not need feedback on formative assessment because it is not for marks. Most of you think that that's false, that students do need feedback, even though it's not for marks. But some of you disagree with that. So I wonder if I've only got 5 minutes left, 4 actually. So I'm actually going to leave that. I'm not going to invite comment on that unless we have a minute at the end. But no, I'm debating with myself. I'm in 2 minds.
I think we should invite a few comments.
I think we should. Right, let's invite a few comments. So for those people who said that that is not an example of summative assessment, would you like to comment?
We have a comment from Lucy on the chat. And she says, I think the last question is based on how large the classes are and that it would take a lot for teachers and lecturers to be able to give feedback each time.
Right.
Okay.
That's important. It touches on the issue of how do we give feedback, especially in large classes, and feedback that's meaningful.
Danny's raised a hand. Danny, if you could just mute yourself.
I did. Well, at least I hope I did this time. Okay, so I think your question too, if you'd had the following phrase somewhat, one example of a summative assessment is a final version of a paper that a student has written over a period of time with review and feedback and a final grade associated with it. I think then people would have been in agreement that it is a summative assessment. However, I think a slightly different view could be that in as much as you give formative assessment by virtue of written feedback over something that's been designed as a formative assessment, then surely your final round of feedback to a student could also be classed as summative assessment. Because now here's my end point. You've reached the end point. Here's my final round of feedback to you, a final summation, if you will, of the work you've done on this activity over X number of weeks or months. So that's how I would view it.
Yes. So if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is that any formative assessment, if it's structured well and if feedback is given constructively, can become summative.
Yes, exactly.
Because formative assessment leads towards summative assessment. And is therefore supportive of summative assessment.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Any other comments, Ancilla?
Well, Sianda on the chat acknowledges that there are many ways in which we can give feedback, and she agrees that feedback is important, of course. Corbis has also said that interactive feedback without marks. Corbis, we have just about a minute if you'd like to perhaps explain that.
What I meant is just while presenting that you can have interactive feedback with the students without specifically scoring them on their remarks, but as part of your formative approach.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm just going to move right through and talk about the value of feedback. So when we think about feedback, we need to think about content. What are we going to say? The amount. How much are we going to say so that it's useful? The timing. When do we give feedback? Is it useful to wait a bit? Immediate feedback? And what's the purpose of it? We need to be giving feedback that's useful, that students can use in order to improve. Otherwise, what's the point of the feedback? And I think an important point has been raised about the challenges of giving feedback. And if you go to, you'll see in the course, if you go there, there's some useful links for alternatives to assessment and also alternatives for giving feedback. The final question, how can we ensure quality teaching and learning? We haven't looked much at the design tool that you downloaded in the beginning, but really the purpose of that design and review tool is to help us to cross-check ourselves. It's a way of checking that we are happy, that we are designing quality learning. It's a way of thinking about different elements, different criteria, and checking with ourselves that we're trying to achieve those goals, that the elements and criteria are about ongoing design, redesign, collaborative design, feedback from colleagues, teamwork. Collaboration is not just amongst students, amongst ourselves. Get feedback from each other about whether our designs are working. And feedback from students. It's scary because they can be our harshest critics. And the idea is in that review tool, you can add and adapt your own criteria as you reflect on what you think constitutes quality design for access and success. And in the course itself, even if you don't do the course, you can go to the course and you'll get an unabridged version of the design and review tool. And I hope you've enjoyed our time together. I certainly have. Thank you very much.
Sheila, the workshop has been intense. It's been intense. I think you've thoroughly engaged all of our brains this morning. So I would say, please send those links to us mentioned, and everyone is free to explore the SADI course at your leisure. I think this has been so important because this has been a very thoughtful workshop about teaching and learning, and it forms a very nice lead up to the workshop that we're having tomorrow with our colleagues from the ADC Access Program, where it's very practical. And, you know, the colleagues are also sharing with us a number of tools. They explore the WhatsApp groups, for example, in more detail. And I just want to thank you, Sheila. Thank you for getting our brains into gear early this morning. What a true teacher, yes. This has been fascinating, and I think we're all going to the tea break now. But Sheila, if you have a few minutes, I'm sure people can ask questions, making their coffee, etc. But from my side, I want to thank you, and you will receive a token of appreciation from us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too. Thank you very much for your participation.
First semester in university was, she started in January 2019. And that first semester did not go well for her. She was enrolled in 6 courses or modules and failed 4 of those 6 modules and found herself on academic warning at the end of her first semester. And this is when I first met, well, I met her a few months later as she was about to begin her second semester. We spoke on the phone one time because she was required to meet with someone in our office in order to register for her next semester of classes. And then we met in person one time a few weeks later at the beginning of that second semester. And then after that, I did not see or hear from Christina much at all. And over about the next 18 months, I went back through my notes. I sent 5 emails to her that, if I'm being honest with myself, were largely formal and impersonal. They had a very institutional feel to them. Maybe not all that surprising. I didn't hear back from her for quite a while. During those 18 months, there were a number of other offices on campus reaching out to her, our multicultural student services, enrollment services, her academic advisor, as well as a peer educator. And as I looked at those messages that went out, because I have access to that as well, those all had a very formal institutional feel to them as well. And what was interesting to me was that there were 5 or 6 people reaching out to Christina, but we weren't collaborating with each other at all. We were all kind of coming at her from a different direction. Occasionally she would respond to an advisor with a short response to the effect of things are fine, but that was about it. And again, I didn't hear much from Christina until this last April, just about a month ago, when she was on the verge of being placed on academic suspension, when we kind of reconnected. And I'll tell you a little bit more about kind of the end of the story in just a moment, but I wanted to hear from you all, and we'll use the chat function at this point. I'd love to hear from you all about, again, where you see the inflection points in Christina's story. How could things have been different? What might have led to a different outcome for her? And how would you make sense of her experience? Why, and maybe to boil it down to its simplest sense, why did Christina struggle? So I'll give you about 60 seconds to chat in your responses, and then we'll discuss for just a moment. Thank you. I may mispronounce some names, but Carlene pointed out that she may not have had meaningful connections with anyone on campus, and I think that's very insightful. And as Ancilla has mentioned, her sense of belonging was probably not very strong. I think we can make some assumptions there as well. And Gracious, this is a very interesting comment. I wonder, Ancilla, do the delegates have the opportunity to unmute themselves and share some thoughts with us using their voice? Or Gracious, I would love to hear from you just a little bit more about what you mean by this idea of institutional culture disconnect. That's a very interesting thought.
All right, I don't mind elaborating. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yes, thank
Awesome.
you.
All right, okay. So what I mean is, in my experience as I'm working with students, the institutional disconnect, it's basically sometimes it's in the little things. The culture of the student, they're probably coming from wherever they're coming from, but when they get into an institution, sometimes it could be in as much as maybe they're all speaking in English, but there's just that disconnect of understanding, what is being communicated in this English. Sometimes it's been just about dress code, and also just the different cultures of this particular student and where they're coming from. So if they were used to maybe being like one-on-one classes, and now they are in a space with such a huge group of learners in one class, so it becomes such a shock in understanding and integrating in such kind of institutional cultures, and just having to be independent, finding out when they're having classes, assignments, submission, where maybe in high school, they had a teacher would always remind them about submission or test and so forth. So basically that's just about that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Gracious. And I think you've touched on a critical aspect of the student experience, and that's this transition into what for many students, particularly first generation students, is a brand new culture. So I appreciate you elaborating on that. I want to draw your attention to a couple of other comments that have been made in the chat. Elizabeth pointed out that Christina may have felt that this was all her fault, that she was struggling because maybe she's not enough, she's not qualified. It's difficult to know exactly what was going through her mind, although in conversations I've had with her since then, I've gained some insight into this. But that's a common mindset that students have when they struggle, is that maybe it's just that I don't have what it takes to be successful here. And that can be very overwhelming. It can be very isolating. And it can really call into question a student's identity as a learner. The other thing I want to point out comes from Danielle. And this is kind of where I want to kind of take the conversation over the next few minutes. Danielle pointed out that Christina may have been feeling overwhelmed by the impersonal nature of the outreach efforts that were made to her and the fact that they were coming from multiple sources. And she probably could tell that none of us were talking to each other. And that I would imagine that at times felt very frustrating for her. So this is a bit of a confession, I guess, on my part in terms of some things that I don't think we did very well as an institution that grew out of the mindset we had about what it means to be successful and what it takes for students to be successful. So the kind of happy ending to this story is we eventually got our act together and reached out in a coordinated way, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. And we're able to connect with Christina. She was able to pass all of her courses during the most recent semester and avoid academic suspension. But our work is not done. Our early alert systems indicate that she's still struggling during the current term. And so it's going to take some additional outreach and continued work with Christina. But our goal is to help to shift her mindset about herself as a learner, which I'll go into more depth in as we progress through the presentation. But all of this has shed light for me on the role that our mindsets have in the way that we interact with students and the role that our institutional mindset and institutional culture plays in how we interpret student failure and student success, which is what I'd like to discuss now. So I hope this story kind of highlights the differing ways that we can interpret student failure. And for me, there's, I think, two common lenses through which we view student experience or student failure in particular. The first is what I would term this idea that mistakes were made, but not by me. We tend to often, and this was pointed out in Elizabeth's comments, we and students pick up on this often. We assume, maybe implicitly, that the onus for success is 100% on the shoulders of students, and that if students have failed, it's because they haven't worked hard enough, they haven't responded to our emails, they weren't prepared enough, that we did our part. You know, we reached out, we made the resources available, but the student just didn't engage and didn't do their part. And this, the photo here comes from U.S. history. This statement was made by Henry Kissinger back in the 70s. He was then serving as the Secretary of State in the United States and had been accused of committing war crimes associated with the United States involvement in conflicts in Cambodia and South America and Vietnam. And his response was, mistakes were made, but not by me. And this lens or this perspective or this mindset sometimes creeps into our work with students. And I think it's largely grounded in a desire to protect ourselves, to justify our own efforts, and is really grounded in fear. Fear of maybe being held accountable for student outcomes, which can be a scary thing because the reality is that we can't control what students do, but we, I think, have more agency than we often give ourselves credit for. The second and more productive lens, I just want to make sure and Himali, I love this idea of failing forward. Thank you for kind of advancing the conversation, because that segues very nicely into the second lens, the more productive lens, that I think is represented very well by this statement by Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. He was a 6th century BC Chinese philosopher, and he said this: a great nation, or I would say a great college campus or university campus, is like a great human. When they make a mistake, they realize it. Having realized it, they admit it. Having admitted it, they correct it. And so it's this, again, this idea of failing forward. And so this second, more productive lens that emerged kind of really for me represents what we'll discuss in just a moment around the idea of growth mindset. It's represented by this idea of what more could I have done? And I want to be very clear that in kind of describing this lens, I want to acknowledge that, again, we can't control every action of students. Students clearly have a responsibility and a stake in their success. However, in most cases, if we have this fail forward sort of mindset, this kind of critical stance towards our work and our practice, we can find ways in which we could have engaged with students more effectively, taught our course more effectively, reached out more effectively, or personally collaborated more effectively. And this perspective is really grounded, instead of being grounded in fear, I think it's grounded in a realistic hope and optimism that there are always things that we could do differently, that we can always get better at our craft, at our practice, and the way in which we engage with students. And so, you know, that's the mindset that can change the way that we approach our work. But before we move on, I also want to acknowledge that this perspective or this mindset can be taken to a problematic extreme when we fail to engage in self-care. Because, you know, if we put 100% of the responsibility for student success on our shoulders, that's a problematic path to be on. So it's important to be balanced in our perspective, to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, especially during our current circumstances when things are so challenging, so that we have gas in the tank, so to speak, to be able to do the good hard work that we need to do with students. And as Carlene has pointed out, we also need to make sure we're always taking into consideration the reality that every student's experience is different. And so, you know, I think it's this balance of learning from our past experiences while being open to the unique aspects of each individual student's experience. So thank you, Carlene, for bringing that up. So at this point, I want to kind of outline where we're headed from here. You know, the ultimate goal is to support student success and to improve the way in which we engage in academic success coaching. And ultimately, we hope to help students adopt a productive learning mindset. But the first step is to change our own mindsets. And then from there, we can reorient our support systems so that they're aligned with and support a productive growth mindset. And then finally, when we're working on ourselves and trying to adopt productive mindsets personally, as well as reorienting our support systems, then we're in a position to help students take up more productive mindsets. But before we get too far down the road, I want to pause. And I think Palesa will help us with this poll. I'm just curious to know from all of you how familiar you are with the concept of growth mindset. For example, the work that Carol Dweck from Stanford University has published around this. So there are 3 response options for this poll. The first is, this is the first time I'm hearing about growth mindset, and I hope you won't feel any shame or guilt about that. When I present these ideas, typically a good percentage of people in the audience are hearing about it for the first time. So that's not a problem at all. The second response is, I've heard of it, but I'm not all that familiar. So maybe you've heard people speak of Carol Dweck's work, or you're familiar with the concept of growth mindset, but don't know too much. And then third, you know, you may be very familiar with this concept and the related research. So if you take just a moment to respond to that poll, that'll help me know how much time we can and should spend kind of reviewing just some basic concepts around mindset. So as you can see, a few more than half of you are relatively familiar with the concept of growth mindset. There are a few for which this will be new, and then there are a handful of you that could be giving this talk yourselves. So I'm glad we've got a good mix of backgrounds in the audience. So we won't spend a great deal of time reviewing the research, but I do want to make sure we have kind of some common ground to work from. So as many of you know, there's kind of 2, Carol Dweck and others since then, have articulated kind of two mindsets. The first is a fixed mindset, which is really about when we approach our experiences through that lens, we tend to be driven by a desire to prove our worth, prove our competence, and to kind of justify our performance. And there's at the core of this mindset is this desire and expectation that I need to do it right now. I need to be perfect from the beginning. And so difficulties or challenges are viewed as threats to our identity, to our competence. And so we may find ourselves, when we're approaching the world from this mindset, thinking or saying things like, either you have it or you don't, you're a math person or you're not, you're a good athlete or you're not, you're musical or you're not. We feel failure, and so we wonder, what if I fail, or what if I make a mistake? I don't want to look bad. And failure is seen as final. It's formative in some sense. Whereas with the growth mindset, much more productive mindset, the goal is to improve. It's this idea of failing forward. And so we kind of give ourselves permission to get better over time. And difficulties, though possibly uncomfortable, are viewed as opportunities to grow and to learn and to become. And so we find ourselves saying or thinking things like, I can get better with effort. Maybe I just need to adjust the way I'm doing things. This is a chance to learn. And we see failure as feedback, as an opportunity to improve. And to your question, Carlene, perfectionism, yes, emerges largely out of a fixed mindset. It's this fear of failure, this need to be perfect right now. And that can be really problematic particularly during times of transition, when we find ourselves in new spaces, navigating new cultures, new contexts. And in many cases, as we see when students transition into university, the academic standards are higher, the coursework is more challenging. And so for a student with a fixed mindset, that can be very frightening. And we see this play out for ourselves in our work as well, right? When we view our work through a fixed mindset and have this need to be perfect all at once, that can keep us from wanting to acknowledge our shortcomings and keeps us from growing. And so these are the basics of fixed and growth mindset. And where this becomes really kind of telling, like I alluded to before, is when students encounter challenges or setbacks. When a student has a low sense of belonging or a fixed mindset, and they encounter a challenge or a setback, they internalize that, the meaning they attach to that experience, whether it's a failed exam or feeling like they haven't made any friends yet, or even something as simple as not being able to find a classroom on campus. Students with a fixed mindset or low sense of belonging will start to say and believe things that, like, maybe I can't be successful here. And that belief becomes a lens through which they see their experiences, and it impacts their behaviors and their choices. They stop engaging with academic staff, with advisors, with peers. They continue to use the same ineffective strategies they've used before, in high school perhaps. And most commonly, they start to withdraw and isolate. And that, of course, leads to lower performance, and that feeds back into the loop, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. On the other side of things, on the right-hand side of this diagram, a student with a growth mindset, they may experience the very same challenge or setback, but the lens through which they make sense of that experience is one of seeing challenges as normal, believing that although things might be hard now, if I continue to work hard and ask for help or adjust my strategies, things will get better. And so this mindset changes a student's trajectory just slightly. They do the things that good learners do, and over time, they experience more success. That feeds back into their mindset, and their confidence grows. And for this reason, it's critical that we find ways to change students' trajectory and shift their mindset as early in their experience as possible. And so in the book that Ancela mentioned, that I helped to co-author, my co-authors and I make what I think is a bold claim. It's in chapter 2 of the book. We we suggest that supporting students in developing these productive learning mindsets may be the single most important outcome for the first year of college. And the reason we believe that is that that mindset and that lens through which we see our experiences impacts a lot of our behaviors, the way we study, the way we ask for help, the likelihood that how likely we are to access resources and to persist through challenges. And it's not to say that other things don't matter, of course they do, but a student is far more likely to adopt effective learning strategies, use resources, connect with others on campus if they have this growth mindset. And as Carlene has pointed out, this all starts with the mindset we have. And so just very quickly, there are some kind of what Carol Dweck calls false growth mindsets. The first is that we're either all fixed or we're all growth. But the reality is that mindset is very contextual. So for example, I grew up with a very fixed mindset towards arts and music. I believed that I had no ability in those areas. And so I distanced myself from anything that might call those inadequacies, would make those inadequacies public. So I didn't take any art classes. I didn't like to do any art. And so that inhibited my growth. On the other hand, I was very involved in athletics, and I had a very growth orientation towards athletics, believed that I could get better with practice and good coaching and time. And so for most of us, there are areas of our lives, and this is true for students as well, where they have a very fixed mindset, and then other areas where we have much more of a growth mindset. The second myth or false mindset is that effort is everything. The reality is that effort matters, but so do effective strategies. If a student is working very hard, but using ineffective learning strategies, that's a path to frustration and discouragement, because outcomes won't change and the student will attribute their challenges to themselves as their own identities. And so one of the things that I want to point out here is that especially in contexts where students are facing pronounced challenges associated with their family situation, their financial situation, a global pandemic, there are environmental barriers that factor into student success. So it's not enough to just say to a student, just work hard. Growth mindset is about more than that. And the reality is that mindset requires all the right ingredients, like a good braai. One of the things I was most looking forward to, had I been able to come to South Africa, was participating in this kind of cultural tradition. But just like a good braai requires all the right ingredients, growth mindset includes removal of barriers, of course, effort, both on our part and the part of students, effective learning strategies, as well as help seeking. And so I want to draw your attention. I'm not going to spend much time on, well, really any time on learning strategies, but I want to draw your attention to a really great resource, a book called Make It Stick. This is the best book I've read in the last decade on effective learning strategies. It's all grounded in empirical research. It's very accessible. So it's a book that we invite our students on our campus to read, and some of the professors on our campus embed it in their course. But it's also a great read for professors and academic staff, academic advisors, peer educators, anyone who's involved in academic success coaching. So a great resource to help students understand the sorts of learning strategies that, when paired with an effective growth mindset, can lead to success over time. Then I'll just also briefly mention the book. We've made a discount code available. Well, the National Resource Center here in the United States has been very gracious in offering a 25% discount to all conference delegates. And that discount is available through May 29th. So I want to extend thanks to Jennifer Koip, the director of the National Resource Center here in the United States, as well as her team for making that possible. So this can all feel very overwhelming. I think when we think about the reality that we need to work on our own mindset, start to reorient support systems, and then of course do the hard, important work of helping students shift their mindset. So with my last few minutes, I'd like to outline some beginning steps that we can take, whether we're the president of a university or have just started in a professional role working with first-year students in kind of an entry-level professional position. And so the three things I want to emphasize over the next few minutes are: first, listening to students; second, really focusing on collaborating rather than competing, especially across institutions, which I think is another kind of mindset shift that's important for us to undertake. And then third, how we can draw on the power of story. So first, a growth mindset is really grounded in humility, this willingness to take an honest look at ourselves, at our work, at our institutions. And that humility can lead us to listen. I hope that it leads us to listen. One resource I want to direct you to that I hope you're all very familiar with is issue 6 of the UMSINDO newsletter that's published by Ancilla and her center. There are 3 student perspectives shared in that issue that I think provide powerful insight into the experiences of the students on your campus. Of course, each student's experience is different, but there are some interesting themes and patterns that emerge across those 3 student stories. So I think the perspectives that you can find in that issue of UMSINDO provide a really good example of the power of listening to students and the learning that can come when we're willing to have that humility. Another resource that Ancilla made me aware of and that I've enjoyed reading over the last week, I'm not all the way through it yet, is a book published in South Africa called Going to University. And I think part of the reason why I was drawn to this book when Ancilla pointed it out to me is it's very qualitative in nature. And like I mentioned at the outset, that's kind of my bias. This book outlines the experiences and stories of 73 South African students 6 years after they started university, and tells their story of entering, of persisting, in some cases exiting, and then in some cases successfully completing their university studies. But listening to those stories, engaging with those stories and others like them, again, provide us with insight in terms of how we can reorient our practices and our support systems to better support students in shifting their mindsets and adopting effective strategies. But most important, there are great resources out there that can give you insight into the experiences of students across South Africa. But possibly the most important thing you can do is to listen to students on your own campus. And that will look different for each campus, but I'd invite you to look for opportunities to engage with students both personally and to convene students in groups when possible. Safely, of course, technology can facilitate much of that, but to listen to their stories and see what you can learn about their experiences. And then to, again, listen with humility and with the growth mindset so that we're listening to find out what we can do differently, not necessarily how students are failing, if that makes sense, going back to those 2 lenses that we discussed at the beginning of the presentation. So I want to share just a portion of just a small excerpt from one of the perspectives that's shared in UMSINDO. This is from Sonali, who's a first-year student at UKZN, and she says this in describing the first few weeks of her first-year experience. Overall, the atmosphere was tense and hectic. This gave way to incredibly stressful circumstances and left me with an uneasy feeling. This uneasy feeling stayed with me throughout the weeks that followed. The uncertainty of being a first-year student was exacerbated with the imminent threat of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Sonali touches on what Ancilla has written very articulately about as the double transition that students are currently experiencing. The challenges of being a first-year student overlaid with the current challenges of attending university during the COVID-19 pandemic. But what impressed me most about Sonali's perspective was how honest it was. I felt for the university leaders at UKZN because she did not pull any punches. She was very honest and clear and direct in describing what she saw as some of the failings on the part of the institution, particularly around course registration. But listening to these stories, again, with humility and a willingness to change, puts us in a position to engage in our work more productively and support students more effectively. So there are, again, great perspectives offered in UMSINDO. And the Ancilla pointed out to me that the meaning of this word is essentially to turn up the sound to hear the bigger message. And generally, that's something I think we need to do more effectively, is to listen more closely and amplify the voices of students, particularly those from underrepresented populations, so that we can better understand their experiences and better support them in their learning and their success. So second, I think there's a tendency at times to compete. That can sometimes happen on a single campus as we get competitive across institutional units and departments for resources or for praise or recognition. Sometimes we may want to point the finger or cast blame at others for why students might be failing. But this also happens across institutions as well when we compete for students. And there will always be some elements of that, right? There's the business aspect of higher education, and so we compete for students in some sense. But I was so inspired by Ancilla and Jennifer Coip's closing address at the 2020 First Year Experience Conference in Washington, D.C., where Ancilla in particular focused on this idea, which was new to me, of Ubuntu. This notion that we're all connected by invisible bonds and that we're all engaged in a shared work. And as I've reflected on that since then, it struck me that when we can see our work in those ways, it positions us to really model for students the sort of learning and collaboration and citizenship, really, that we hope they'll take with them from their university experience. And it gets at kind of the dual purposes of higher education. Of course, there's an individual benefit for students when they have that experience, but when we can collaborate effectively and do our work together as much as we can, outcomes for all students increase, and that there's a societal and a global benefit when that happens as well. And so really embracing this notion of Ubuntu and getting serious about seeing ourselves engaged in shared work, both on our campuses as well as across our campuses, I think can make a huge difference and represents another step towards a growth mindset that really extends beyond ourselves and compels us to help others to grow and to see others' success as our own success, both the students we work with as well as colleagues. I want to be mindful of time, and so I want to offer some more kind of practical strategies in terms of collaboration. The first is you've got a great resource in the South African National Resource Center. They're poised and positioned to help support and facilitate collaboration, particularly across institutions. So I hope you'll engage with them. Early alert systems that help you and your colleagues on your campus identify those students who might be at risk of experiencing challenges can facilitate dialogue and collaboration about who to help as well as how to help them. One of the things that we've experienced a great deal of success around on our campus are student success stakeholder groups. So a diverse group of stakeholders, from admissions to academic advisors to academic teaching staff to first year experience staff, who convene on a regular basis to discuss how to support specific students who might be experiencing challenges. Again, this notion of Ubuntu. Then one of the things that the National Resource Center here in the United States has been very helpful in facilitating in my home state of Utah is a Utah First Year Experience Consortium. I don't know exactly what that might look like in your space, but when you can coordinate your efforts and collaborate with colleagues on other campuses who bring a different perspective, that can be very powerful. We've seen the fruits of that in Utah as we've organized a consortium of first-year experienced professionals across the state in a variety of professional roles and tackled problems and challenges that we hold in common across our campuses. And then finally, interinstitutional research teams are another great way to collaborate if you're in a position to engage in research. Then finally, I want to touch on the power of story. I think I'll end with this notion and then offer just a brief kind of concluding remark and then hopefully have some time for some dialogue and questions. But when we think about the stories we share, there are three types of stories that we often tell, not just in higher education, but just as we engage with one another as humans. The first is what Bruce Feiler is the researcher that I should have put that citation on this slide. I apologize for that. But Bruce Feiler has identified these three types of narratives. The first is what he describes as ascending narratives. And these are very common. We like to tell these stories because they make us feel good. It's a bottom to top or rags to riches sort of story. So for a student, I wasn't that smart. I came in underprepared, but I worked hard and now I'm succeeding. That feels like a nice story because I think our hope in telling that story is that will lead to optimism. Then there's the descending narratives. These are rather discouraging. For a student, I thought I was prepared. I was really smart in high school, but now I'm really struggling. So kind of falling off the mountain, so to speak. But what Feiler's research suggests is that the most powerful narrative is what he describes as an oscillating narrative. It's a balanced narrative. It's more realistic and authentic and genuine. And the rhythm of this narrative looks like this. I really struggled at first, but I worked hard and I did well. Then I took my first test or started a new program and it got hard again, but over time, I figured things out and things have improved. And the key components of these good mindset stories are an authentic voice. So stories from peers are really powerful for students. Stories that normalize challenge, not systemic challenges and barriers that we as professionals should be working to remove, but the normal challenges of transitioning into university. These stories discuss the importance of both effort and using effective strategies. They emphasize help seeking, and the meta message is this idea of incremental growth, that things get better over time. And so those are the sorts of stories that I believe that we can share and highlight to help students start to adopt a growth mindset. Finally, I want to end by kind of revisiting some key questions. And I hope these are questions that serve as kind of points of discussion and springboard to conversation for you and your colleagues. The first is, how is my own mindset? How is my mindset influencing the mindset of my colleagues, of my students? And how is my mindset contributing to an overall institutional mindset? And second, how is a growth mindset and support for resilience represented in our support systems? Do we believe that students can improve and change and in some sense maybe be redeemed if they've struggled early on? And do we have support systems in place that convey that message both explicitly and implicitly to students? And then finally, how are we helping students adopt a growth mindset and be resilient? Are we having those conversations with them? Are we providing access to the resources they need to be successful, helping them develop effective learning strategies, and actively not just teaching content, but helping students take up this identity as a learner and as an individual that's pursuing growth and becoming, as opposed to just knowledge acquisition. And then finally, I just want to finish with this, a word on hope. Dr. Drew Gilpin-Faust, who by training is a historian, visited our campus virtually a few months ago. She's the former president of Harvard University, and gave just a remarkable address on the critical role that hope plays in education. And her transcript isn't available yet, so I can't quote her directly. So I had to go off of my notes, but she presented this idea that to be educated is to possess both the ability to see that things can be otherwise and to have the skills to bring about that envisioned future. And for me, that is a growth mindset. It's this ability and willingness to see things as they really are, to recognize our shortcomings and failings and where things can improve, but also to have the optimism and the hope that things can get better. And as we adopt that mindset, as we help our institutions adopt that mindset, and as we help students adopt that mindset, the educational experience will be transformed for all of us. So I thank you for your attention and willingness to engage with me, and look forward to, I think we have about 10 minutes on Scylla for some questions and dialogue. So.
This is a very uplifting topic for us, Bryce. I would say it's even more important for us to hear this kind of message now during the time of COVID, when I would say that hope is in short supply. Thank you. We've just got, I think, under 10 minutes. If there are any questions, you can pop them on the chat and I'll facilitate them, or you can also raise a hand. I think there's lots of thank yous for a brilliant presentation. I wonder if I could just jump in before anyone else raises a hand and pose a question. You know, as I've said to you, Bryce, South Africa is a troubled society. And as you know, as individuals, we don't exist in a vacuum. We exist in the sort of broader context of society, of other institutions, the family. And I wonder how we can get students to believe in themselves when the outside world sends them exactly the opposite messages. What work do we need to do? And I also refer to one of the 3 questions that you posed about working on ourselves. And I wonder how we can teach students growth mindset when we ourselves have got work to do on ourselves.
Yeah, great question. So I think for me, one of the keys in the inner work that we need to do, as well as helping students find hope and kind of recognize the resilience and capacity that they possess, is in reflection. I think for us, both for us and for students, one of the keys, and there's actually really powerful research to back this up, which I actually have a slide that I can share in a moment that outlines kind of the steps here. But the idea is to identify kind of our own growth mindset stories, because no matter who we are and how much we think we may have failed, there's some part of our life where we've demonstrated resilience and overcome challenges. And reflecting on those experiences and then telling those stories and telling them publicly can be very powerful. So some of those may come from an academic context. Others may come from a previous job, or even just escaping the challenges of poverty or financial constraints or health challenges. But as we reflect on times when we have maybe been in a state of transition, encountered a challenge, persisted through that challenge, asked for help, worked very hard, and then seen improvement happen over time. I think there are very few people who don't have a story like that to tell if they're really to step back and reflect on their experiences. But as academic staff and institutional leaders, if we can be open and authentic and transparent in telling those stories and sharing those stories with students, and then encouraging student leaders, peer educators to do the same, I think that helps our mindset grow, and then it encourages the mindset, encourages growth in the mindset of the students who are hearing those stories. I think a second way that as institutional leaders that we can work on ourselves and model for students a growth mindset is as we listen to their stories and find ways in which we can improve the programs and the resources that we offer to students, is to be very public and transparent about that, to kind of report back, so to speak, to students. You know, we heard you. This is what we heard you saying. These are the challenges and shortcomings we've identified, and these are our plans for making improvements. That, in very powerful ways, models for students a growth mindset and signals to them, this is what it means to be a learner. This is what it means to be part of a university, is to engage in this kind of work.
We need to be role models. There's a couple of comments on the chat. And one of them is from Constance, who's asking, how do we get access to purchase the book? So I think you have an imminent sale, Bryce. If I understand correctly, it's available through May 29th from the NRC.
Yes.
And at a 25% discount. Thank you, generous colleagues from the NRC.
And I am going to share a link in the chat to the site where the book can be purchased. And I also want to, I want to be very open in saying that I receive no proceeds from the sales of the book. We received an honorarium when we wrote the book. And so whether it sells 1 million copies or 1 copy doesn't impact my compensation. I'm sure Jennifer and her colleagues would love for 1 million copies to sell, but just know that I'm not trying to pad my wallet at all. But
no, absolutely.
So the link is in the chat.
Do we have any other raised hands?
Bryce, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I think my question, as I'm sitting here trying to digest what you're saying, and I'm in agreement with almost all of it, I'm just wondering about a gritty type of growth mindset, because my sense of the current generation is that they're being told all over the place they can do it. You know, it's not that they're being told they can't. They almost have a too strong belief in their own abilities and not enough of a sense of groundedness so that they will have to fail forward, not just forward, but first fail. And I don't mean they need to fail at university. I just mean they need to be gritty. You know, they need to be strong enough to deal with what is really a massive challenge. So I just think for me, that balance is quite important, because what I do with our students, and I think what is important, is to warn them about how difficult it's going to be, and then encourage a growth mindset.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Andre, I appreciate you raising that question and that issue, because I think it ties into this notion of false growth mindset that I briefly mentioned earlier on in the presentation, which has been a significant concern for Carol Dweck since publishing her book Mindset back in 2006, because often both students and educators only get half the message, which is, work hard, you're great, everything will work out if you believe in yourself. And that's only half the message. The other half of the message is you've got to prepare yourself for challenges. They will come, and challenges actually can be very productive. I mean, that's the whole notion of the educational enterprise, right? Is we thoughtfully construct and design educative challenges for students that educative experiences for students that lead to growth. And so I think the key, maybe if I were to sum it up, concisely, just I want to make sure that we are able to start Jennifer's workshop on time. Kind of comes back again to this idea of a balanced, oscillating narrative. The story we're telling about university is it's going to be challenging. You are going to be stretched. And, of course, we want to eliminate the unproductive challenges, the systemic barriers that don't add to a student's education, just become frustrations and obstacles. But to be very open and honest with students that there are some challenges we want. We want you to engage with challenges, to face adversity, to be gritty. And if you will, yes, work hard and persist, but also use effective strategies and ask for help. That's the key to success. It's not enough to just, for me to sit and believe that I can do this, I can be successful, I believe in myself. If we only tell half the story, that's actually, I think, very, very problematic, because what happens is if a student's mindset is just believe in myself and things will get better, but they don't change their strategies and don't use their resources, they're likely to continue to experience quote unquote failure, which then shifts them back into a fixed mindset. Because at that point, all they're left to kind of believe or attribute their failure to is their identity. It must just be that I'm not enough. But the failing in those cases is ours, because we haven't equipped them with the strategies and provided access to the resources and told this kind of balanced, oscillating story of success. And that's what we need, is this comprehensive approach that, yes, emphasizes effort and belief, but is grounded in the science of learning, really, and what we know about student success in terms of, again, being willing to use resources, ask for help, and engage in the educational experience in those sorts of ways. So I hope that addresses your kind of question and comment, Andre. We need to take a comprehensive approach.
Bryce, we are going to release you for your breakfast now. We want to thank you, and we hope you're going to keep in touch with us, and you will be receiving something delightful as a token of our appreciation in the post, probably in the next week or so. Okay. So thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. And now we can move on, bang on time, to our next workshop presenter. Jennifer Koip does not need much introduction, as she has graced our annual conference a number of times now. I asked her to do this workshop because of her expert knowledge in this area of FYE programs and how to make them more coherent and integrated, as well as the ability to easily contextualize the South African situation. As you know, Jennifer is the Executive Director of the National Resource Center for First Year Experience and Students in Transition, our sister organization in the United States. She is also an affiliated faculty member in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policies at the University of South Carolina. And she holds various other distinguished academic appointments. Jennifer is such an inspiration, and she's also a role model to women in the higher education sector. I consider Jennifer Koip to be a great friend of our South African first year experience community. And I might add, she is also my dear friend. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ancilla, and it is lovely to see everyone. Can you hear me? I know that this is the prerequisite question of any virtual conference. Are you able to hear me effectively?
Yes, we are.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. It is lovely to be back. I am currently sipping my coffee, as it's quite early here, out of the mug you all gave me in the 2019 conference, along with the other participants. It says, FYE, be the difference. And I thought that was fitting for this and a good setting for us to get started. I know it's late in the day. I know that, great, yay, Carlene, cheers to you if you have it right now, your mug. I know that you probably are at a saturation point, and I'm going to do my best to make this engaging. I'm going to start by sharing my screen just so that we are able to look at some things. I'm a visual person, and I like to have things to look at. And so I am also going to do my best to try and monitor the chat, but I will ask for Ancilla's assistance in that regard. Before I get started, I do want to do a land acknowledgement. I saw this done last year, and since I was so moved, since I saw it done and the messages it gave about humility and equity, I have vowed that I would do this. Now I realize we're standing in different spaces and on different land, but the land that I stand on here in the United States, in Columbia, South Carolina, at the University of South Carolina, actually occupies the traditional ancestral land of the Cherokee and Congaree people, which are indigenous populations here in the United States. It's also land, the University of South Carolina, in which enslaved people lived and worked and built this particular campus. And I want to honor them. I want to acknowledge and remember the histories of violence that precede our gathering, and to recognize the Indigenous and Black claims to life and land that I am situated on in this moment. And I want to recenter those claims as we commit to being better humans, better caring for each other, commit to Ubuntu, and have the humility to learn from some terrible histories and change. So I hope you, thank you for indulging me this. It is very important to me to advance our equity considerations and concerns. And I hope that you all will, in a moment, honor the ancestral individuals of the land on which you situate yourselves as well. I am here to talk about stars in the constellation. Collaboration is the key to successful FYE programs. And I did try to spell programs the correct way for you all and include the E. But in any event, I did want to, this is what we're talking about. And hopefully you'll understand the first portion of this. Of course, I'm an academic, so we don't do a title unless there's a colon. So the stars in the constellation piece hopefully will become very evident as to why that's the selection of this particular topic. So I am going to go forward, and these are the session objectives. What I hope you will get out of being here is an introduction to this idea of some conceptual, theoretical, and practical approaches. I'm a nerd. I am a data nerd. I study things. I'm definitely into theory, but I also very firmly believe in the connection between research and theory and practice. Otherwise, it's to no end. So I do want to represent all of those. I want us to be real and discuss some of the challenges about cross-functional approaches to the first year experience. Collaboration is hard, and we'll talk more about that. And I think it's great that we have a growth mindset, that we were situated, with Bryce's beautiful talk, so that we can go into this with a growth mindset and really approach collaboration in that mental space. And you are actually going to do some work, and I'm going to have you examine some of your campus practices based upon the principles we're talking about. So hopefully you're warmed up and excited to engage in this process with me. So a couple qualifications. I am with you for 90 minutes, which may seem like a very long time of listening to me. Sometimes it's a very long time for me to listen to myself, but this topic is so huge, and I will really in some ways only begin to scratch the surface of that. I do talk quickly, as you'll notice, but I don't talk that quickly that I can do this. I've taught entire 15-week seminars in the College of Education on this topic. And so I will do my best I did my best to curate good information that we can then use. I am in the United States. I have had the incredible honor of working with the South African National Resource Center on Scylla and Andre and other colleagues and with many of you. I've also had a chance to work around the world in global spaces, but I have got to honor the fact that I'm situated in a space and most familiar with the United States. So you're going to see that come up. The data I draw from is there, but I have tried to selectively orient some of the examples so that they are relevant to a South African context. I also want to say, as I mentioned before, I am a data nerd. I will be showing some data. I always joke that I was the vice president of the math club in 7th grade, which is junior high school / middle school in the United States. Not a fast track to being the most popular girl in school by any means, but it certainly was, I situate myself in a very data-oriented perspective. But I will steal from Andre something I heard years ago where he said, you need to be data-informed and student-centered. So I'm not data-centered, I'm data-informed in order to remain student-centered. This is also virtual. I got up this morning and dreamt of the wonderful times I've been with you all in the same spaces here in the US and Europe, as well as in your home country of South Africa, and wish that was the case. And I'm going to do my best to make this as interactive as possible. 2 ways I'm going to do that. Palesa is going to help me with some polling and walk me through some of that. And I'm also going to ask you to engage in the chat. There are specific questions I will want your feedback on, and I want that to happen in the chat. We're also going to play a little bit later with the reaction button at the bottom of your Zoom. So if you're not familiar with that, look at the bottom of your screen. I believe on mine, it's all the way to the right. There's a button that says reactions, and there are several there. So I'll have a chance to gauge your reactions as well. So hopefully you're ready, and we can get going on this topic. So I would like to begin at the beginning. I would like to situate ourselves in some definitions and understanding of what it is that we're talking about when we say the first year experience. And I realize that might sound like a ridiculous place to be talking about things when you're in the second day, towards the end of your second day of a conference on this topic. But I'm a firm believer of the fact that words matter and definitions are important, and situating ourselves here is critical to us to be able to have a productive conversation. So let me start with, what are we talking about? So this is a lovely definition that I often use from Drew Koch and John Gardner, who many of you will recognize. John Gardner is the founding father of the first year experience movement here in the United States and across the world. And this definition is the one I use all the time when people say, well, what do you mean when you say the first year experience? Because students have a first year of college, whether we intervene or not, right? I mean, it's not as if they don't have that experience. So what experience do we mean when we say FYE, or the first year experience? And this is a really lovely definition that I really like, which is this idea that it's not a single program. It's an intentional combination of academic and co-curricular student support efforts within and across post-secondary institutions. In the United States, we have a very robust transfer pathway where students will start at one institution, often a two-year institution, and then transfer to a four-year institution to complete their degree. And there are many reasons for that range from financial to students who are exploring, majors and disciplines. But the idea that students are sometimes really engaging with more than one institution of higher education. And so when we talk about the first year experience, we also have to be a bit more inclusive, not just of one program on one single campus, but of a multiple campus experience. And particularly if you're in a system, a campus system, or you have different physical locations of your university, this also comes into play. But there's more to this, so if you look to George Koo, he talks about a high quality first year experience being this notion of, of emphasis on critical inquiry, writing, information literacy, some really high order skills. So we're asking a lot of students, we're asking for a lot of that development and growth that we heard Bryce talk about, and really a mindset to be engaging with them in that first year. So the one thing I do want to point out, I miss this in this slide that I just shared, is this notion of collaboration and connection from the get-go, right? This idea that's not a single program, but a connected, intentional combination. That's a critical word, right? Combination speaks to the fact that there's more than one and they've got to play nice. They've got to collaborate. And that's what this whole session is about. So we go through this high quality. We have Betsy Barefoot, who's another sort of founding member of the movement, of the first year experience movement in the United States. And she talks about, that's great, we can talk what it is, but we also have to talk about issues of quality. And the fact that an excellent first year experience is one that spans the curriculum and co-curriculum and is systemic. Again, this idea of a connected, collaborative approach. You can't just kind of patch one little idea onto a larger educational initiative and say that's the first year, because that will fall off. We all know that the things that are sort of add-ons to the educational enterprise are ones that go away when we have crisis or leadership changes or resource constraints. So, she says it has to be central, it has to be systemic, and it can't be just kind of a patched on idea. And then lastly, all of those individuals contributed to this book many years ago called Achieving and Sustaining Institutional Excellence. And they said, they put these 5 criteria for what makes an excellent first year experience program. And you can read them here, but one of the things I wanted to do, and I highlighted in this next version of the same content, the wording that suggests that collaboration and integration is key. So you'll see comprehensive approach, various initiatives, broad impact, institutionalization, and then of course the last one, which is most speaking to the idea of collaboration, that it requires an excellent first year experience requires involvement of a wide range of faculty, student affairs professionals or student support professionals, academic administrators, and other constituent groups, including students themselves. So the notion of this is that you cannot be excellent. You cannot strive for excellence in your first year experience approach unless you are able to engage some type of integrative and collaborative approach. No man can do this alone. It is truly a group effort in that regard. So that's where we are. Hopefully you're still with me. Everybody can take a sip of their water or their coffee or whatever you're doing, hopefully again out of one of the SANRC mugs. And I see the conversation, maybe we'll get new ones for the 2021 mug that has online emphasis. But we're going to talk now and switch to why you do this. So we talked about the what, now the why becomes really critical. And so Palesa, you're going to have to walk me through how to do a poll. But I want to ask my first poll question to you is, what is your primary institutional objective for the first year experience? And I selected a few here. Oh, is it academic success? Is it connection with the institution? Is it establishing support networks for students? Is it retention or persistence to the second year? Or is it something else entirely? Are you able to see the polling results on your screen? Okay, it looks like we have received this, so or it's moving slightly, so I'll let people continue for like maybe another 15 seconds to weigh in. We have a lot of individuals who have voted. Thank you so much for your participation. So we see that academic success is the #1 response of these 5, followed by retention or persistence to the second year. And then we have, connection to the institution and establishing support networks coming up as a small reasons. And then one individual who laid claim, Carlene, if hopefully I'm saying your name correctly, said other, and it's the idea of well-being for student success overall, not just academic success. So I appreciate you sharing that with me. And I think this is wonderful. We see that, academic success won and that retention is part of the consideration. And what you'll see is that we asked this question on our national survey of first year experiences in the United States. And we were able to capture these data from over 537 campuses, so a very large swath of individuals, and academic success strategies was at the top of that list as well. So you have good company in that regard. One of the things that I think a lot of individuals sort of misuse this perhaps is, and I respect this, the idea that the first year experience is about retention. And I think that that is true, but I think it's indirectly about retention. Retention, as John Gardner often says, or persistence to the second year, is a side effect of us doing a well-intentioned, a thoughtfully constructed, integrated first year experience. That if we focus on all these other things and these other concerns and build students' ability for growth mindset and development and learning, then retention will happen. And so you will see here that the most frequent institutional objectives that are named on this survey were really the academic success strategies, major in planning and exploration. Then we get into some of the things about knowledge of campus, connection with campus, this idea that we alluded to in Bryce's presentation about understanding what college level expectations are and how they might be different from how I did things before and how I might learn from that. And then we see retention and it comes up. So it's not that I'm heartened that it's on the table, but it's not the top reason, because I think that it's in combination with some other elements as well. You see some other things going on here. Do these surprise you? Is anybody surprised by these particular things being the most frequent institutional objectives for the first year experience? If so, you can dump that in the chat and we can have a chance to explore that. You can communicate with Ancilla and she can be the mouthpiece for us, but this is sort of where the most frequent, but there are some other ones. This is a long list. So there are some less frequent ones that less than 50% of the institutions, and they could mark as many as they wanted. This was a mark, all that apply. And they had other ones that were of interest. And so the first year is a complicated, multifaceted experience. We are trying to achieve multiple aims, and so are our students. And we have to acknowledge that, and which is one of the reasons that that this notion of collaboration becomes so critical. So you see some other reasons for why people do this, intercultural competence, developmental education, getting students ready, health and wellness. I know that was the other one that Carlene mentioned. Other things like communication skills, literacy of all different types. And the least frequent are these. So these are ones that were responded by less than 1/3 of the institutions in the sample. Again, some other ones really here on very specific skill sets tend to be a little bit less of a focus of the first year experience. And then we have a 4.3% that says the institution hasn't figured out campus-wide objectives for the first year. So I'd say that this group of individuals, this group of campuses maybe has sort of a different enterprise. They're in a different space than others. And so if you're a member of this group, I would say you certainly have a wonderful opportunity to situate yourself. And that is because, you might say, why does it matter why we're doing it? Like, we need to focus on what we're doing in, because we have to kind of stay grounded in what we're trying to achieve, right? And to be quite honest, the rationale for your first year experience program really tells a lot about the values of your institution. It gives you a guidelines of how you interact with students. It's a point for you to come back to when you're trying to set up assessment. And it also speaks to who you want to collaborate with on campus. If you are, for example, focused on academic success and major planning and exploration, you're going to have different partners than if it's to, for example, do skill development or to make a connection with the institution. That's going to think about different partners. So you want to think about why you're doing this work. And I think those individuals who've been doing first year experience programs for a long time also tend to be like sort of forget, like what do we do this for in the first place? And there are moments for refinement. So I'm looking at Andre's student success work is often subversive. What I mean is that we can use institutional needs to pursue other goals, often less mechanic and more human. So you're right. This goes back to your thing about how we want to remain student-centered and we don't want to become distracted by these other things. So, it's true. Again, I think we need to be honest with ourselves about the reasons we're doing things or the reasons things started and how they might evolve over time. I know the reasons we did things on our campus or reasons we did things in the United States over this past year have been a lot more transactional. We are trying to keep people safe. We are trying to get people connected. So there are different contexts for things. Obviously in a COVID environment, there are different priorities and we have to honor those shifting priorities, but the larger meaning of why we do things is important to connect ourselves to. So I encourage you to take a moment, whether it's today or back on your campuses, of what is the rationale? What is the historic rationale for you doing a first year experience program? Was it born out of a retention crisis? Was it born out of somebody's pet project and a student success initiative? And examine what that student success initiative was. So there are all sorts of different elements to this. So we talked about the what, we've talked about the why, and now we're going to talk about the how. So in the chat, I'm going to ask you to please chat with me a little bit about this idea of what are the primary educational initiatives that make your first year experience program. So if you were to say, what is it? Exactly like what do you do for your FYE? What are the programs that encompass your first year experience? What would you say? How would you answer that? And if you could put that in the chat, I would love to be able to share that and I'll moderate that.
We could possibly also invite a few raised hands, maybe for 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Please. So anyone wants to unmute and chat? So we have pre-arrival advising, new student orientation, peer education. Thank you, Bryce. Some other folks. Orientation, it looks like a specific UCT cares, destination UCT. So a couple institution specific one, open days for students and parents, orientation. Student orientation seems to be a common one. That's great. Maybe some other example, extended orientation, focused student success initiatives, which I'm imagining come out of a student success center. Thanks, Lauren. Have a good day. I understand. I'm a teacher as well. You don't get to choose. So have a great class. First year experience seminar, that's one that comes up commonly. Mentoring, wonderful. These are all wonderful initiatives and they're run the gamut. And I think this is really good. And one of the things I do, academic peer mentoring is huge. I love that. So I want you to again, go to the data again, as that 7th grade math club nerd. So to take a look at what were some of the most common initiatives that we saw in first year experience programs in the United States. And again, the great news is that this was a mark all that apply kind of question. And you will see that these add up to well over 100, which means people were marking a lot of different initiatives, which is great because that's the whole goal, that it isn't, as we saw with John and Drew, any one specific initiative. So we see here in this to be quite honest, in the United States, this surprises most people, that academic advising, and let me back up and say that this question is worded in a way that we are asking for them to tell us the programs that are specifically designed for first-year students. So this notion, academic advising, doesn't just exist on campus and first-year students can take advantage of it. It, in fact, is for first-year students. So as we saw, Janie just talked about academic peer mentoring. Academic advising overall by far rules the day as the most common first-year experience program. And that surprises a lot of people because I think in the United States, we're known for what's number 4 on this list, which are first-year seminars. So this kind of surprised a lot of individuals when we looked at it and we had to re-examine these kind of common practices. We also have what's called early alert systems here, and I'm not sure if there's a counterpart in the South African context. These are often technology supported initiatives, but not always, where a student, if they show early signs of not showing up to class or failing an exam or having sort of an incident in a classroom that doesn't quite reach the level of needing disciplinary action, but just something that's a warning sign of the student early on, the system allows us to capture that and communicate that across different constituencies on campus, such as, for example, the academic advisor, certain key faculty, if there's a student mentor involved with that to support that student, the Student Success Center or Academic Success Center is often notified to reach out to that student. It's a very effective program, and it is the second most common. And I think it's becoming more common as we see more routinized and technologically supported elements. Orientation, which many of you mentioned, that's certainly at the top there as well. And then, of course, first-year seminars. What I think is exciting, though, is that the way other people answered other items. So things like we talked about, we heard peer leaders, peer education's on that list, not necessarily support only academic, but other. And we see other campus partners. So placement testing, the idea that I don't know that many people would think of placement testing as an intentionally supportive or intentionally developmental piece of the first year experience. Historically, that's been very transactional, but these are potential partners. And if we want to think about and adopt a growth mindset, who better to engage us with us in that than, for example, our placement testing colleagues. While this might seem sorting and sort of draconian to put people into these spaces of, oh, you're now in developmental or remedial education, instead, maybe it's a way to sort of say, this is where you're situated now, and here are some goals, and here's a growth mindset to do that. And that's a wonderful kind of partner in a first year experience program. Convocation is another one for us. General education. So the curriculum itself is not just hoops to jump through or hurdles to clear. They're in fact intentional opportunities for partnership. So if we were to then continue to go to some other ones, these are less common initiatives, but still, substantial proportions. So residential programs. I have seen your residential campuses. I've been there. And so I know that Residence Life colleagues are critical partners in this whole process of the first year experience. And then we have learning communities or gateway courses, which in the United States are those courses that are generally historically known as weeder courses. They weed people out, right? So they're the calculus class or the writing course that leads to other majors. Everything from leadership programs, which is a very exciting notion, the idea that students from the beginning, from the first year, are engaged in leadership training and leadership opportunities. So I think that's really great that oftentimes we think of first year students as people to be led instead of thinking of them as future leaders. And so that's a wonderful, partnership opportunity as well. And experiential learning and learning beyond the classroom. We also have a few that are less common. And these are ones that in the United States have been initiatives that have been much more at the junior and senior years, like undergraduate research and study abroad. These numbers used to be below 10% on a national level of institutions saying that these were part of them. We see these growing, even though they're at the bottom of the list, substantially. And so especially undergraduate research, again, the idea, I mentioned for leaders, instead of looking at students as consumers of research, thinking of them as future contributors and giving them the skills, engaging them in the process of doing original inquiry. So again, these are initiatives that are a full gamut of opportunity, but they're also potential partners that we can consider as we put together our program. So even though there might be sort of less prominent campus less prominent campus programs, some partners are inherent in that. Now, I want to also mention that these colors and the colors are meaningful, and we'll come back to those later. but you'll see that the darker the coloring of the figure, the more prominent that initiative is in the first year. So hopefully from this, you're thinking about how you might expand, the different programs that are part of your first year experience as intentional engagement, and also potential partners, people you didn't think about elsewhere. I will say that another one that isn't here, that I think we will probably ask in the future, that I want to put out there as intentional opportunities for a first year experience and potential partners, are a lot of the other transactional services, financial aid, the bursar's office, the registrar's office, the places where students pay their bills, get their financial aid, sign up for their courses. Again, historically, we have dismissed these spaces, or admissions, we dismiss these spaces as being very transactional. But more students are probably engaging in getting financial aid or bursaries than they are in maybe learning communities or certainly study abroad initiatives. So when we think about the first year experience, we have to think about places students show up, whether that's in the medical center, whether that's in parking services, whether that's in, again, signing up for classes with your registrar. You have partners on campus that we can intentionally engage in a developmental approach to student learning. And when we think about a collaborative approach, we have to think about partners in these transactional spaces as partners in our developmental approach. Each of those experiences has an opportunity for development and skill gaining. So again, thinking about who the partners are that are common: advisors, orientation colleagues, maybe librarians, faculty, as well as challenging ourselves to think of new partners. Now, hopefully you're still with me. Can I see some thumbs up or something on your reactions in the chat? Let me know you're still there. Excellent, I appreciate it. Thank you. Always good. Good. I want to speak briefly. Some of you may know this. I am a graduate of a university in the United States called the University of California, Los Angeles, and I received my undergraduate and doctorate degree there. UCLA, as it's better known, is a really good school. It's wonderful, but it's also very well known for its athletics. And there is a coach there named John Wooden, or was a coach there, who was a basketball coach and had the most winning record for a long time of a basketball coach in the United States at the college level. Beyond that, though, John Wooden was known for being an incredible coach, not just of athletics, but he was a men's basketball coach, so developing young men. And he was actually voted multiple times as being the most effective coach in athletics at any level in any sport. So professional athletics, any sport, men's, women's, John Wooden was widely and has been widely known as being the most effective person in terms of developing talent in his athletes. He often would say, it isn't what you do, but how you do it. And this is much of the overlap of what Bryce did. So it's not just what we do, not the list of programs that we have, but how we're engaging with creating an intentional, integrative, and collaborative experience. So I'm doing my Just Desserts as a UCLA alum by quoting John Wooden. And I highly recommend. He has leadership philosophies, coaching philosophies that are very transferable outside of athletics. So if you want a good read on those things, I recommend John Wooden. And this is where we start getting into the collaboration. You might have all of those lists of things, right? You might have every single one of those programs that was on that previous list and then some, but you might do them separately. And we need to think about how we engage them together for more effectiveness. Now, nothing is probably more of a, self-promoting move than quoting yourself, but I was a second author on this. My dear colleague, Dallin George Young, who has been a speaker and visited the SANRC conferences in the past. Also, he was a lead author on this, so I have to give him credit, and he let me come and hang out and help with this. But we did something called a cross-functional framework. We were invited to put this together. And the basis of this is a quote that Dallin put there, is that supporting first-year student success is a topic that's not easily localized or specific to one functional area. So an effective FYE requires campus-wide coordination and cooperation. It needs to be owned by multiple people. It needs to include multiple constituents if we're going to have a truly effective wraparound developmental experience. And this is where the collaboration piece comes in. But let's be honest, that's hard. It's very hard to engage other people. We can say, go play nice with everybody on campus. And you may go, I might want to, but there are forces that are really working against me. And that is absolutely true. So let me validate you first and foremost, that this is more than just goodwill. There are some real navigation tools we need to discuss. And so again, validating you, higher education organizations were not really designed well for institutional and organizational collaboration. We were not designed for that. And you might sit there and say, well, why? And I want to ask you, why? What are the main challenges in your spaces to creating a collaborative FYE program on your campus? Why is it hard for you to do that? Knowing that that's the best practice. And it's a chat, so I'm going to ask you to please put that in the chat. What are some of the main challenges to creating a collaborative first-year experience program on your campus? I'm going to take this moment to take a sip of my coffee out of my 2019 FYE mug. Exactly, Andre. We're called a university. Boundaries within units, financial limitations, of course, money, resources, institutional buy-in and ownership. Yep. Sometimes this ownership goes both ways, right? Sometimes it's that one person owns it and they get a little territorial. Other times it's that everybody thinks they own it, but nobody's taking charge of it. So ownership can kind of go both ways. Silos, absolutely. What are some other challenges that you see? Territorialism, ownership, absolutely. Accountability, huge one. And responsibility, which goes with accountability. Absence of institutional FYE objectives. Yep. All these things. I'm so grateful that you all are seeing these and able to identify them. Time constraints. Yes, Carlene, I'm with you. We are overextended and strapped. Competition, sitting on the outside and not do the hard work of building momentum and changing parts of institutional cultures. Yep. Yes. So many of these things. And I am in some ways very grateful that you honor me with your honesty. So thank you. And you all using the words that in some ways I feel like you can probably be doing this talk for me. And I hope that you're going to be able to get something new on this. Yes, the change in the universities is evolutionary, generally not revolutionary. Absolutely, Andre. So that is a space that I completely appreciate. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things, and some of the things you mentioned are absolutely showing up in other spaces and in literature. So Adriana Kizar is a wonderful colleague. She's at the University of Southern California, the other USC. I'm at the University of South Carolina. But the idea is that we are built on separate structures of disciplines, department. We have parsed out in higher education, you live here and do this, you live there and do that. Even to the point of not just essentially disciplines department, but also the notion of academic and student support divisions. I appreciated that Carlene said earlier that she, that she bucked being able to mark that second one and the why do you do it? Because it was just academic support and not student support writ large. And that speaks to the very challenge we have of what kind of support am I in charge of? What piece of the student experience do I own? Is it in the classroom? Is it in the residence halls? Is it in a library? Is it in the student success center? Is it in their, the other spaces of their lives? We also very much honor specializations. Anybody, I'm sure many of you have done a dissertation or read dissertation titles, and goodness gracious, if they're not getting so super specific these days, that you are looking at a tiny niche of an entire experience. And that is where we head with academia. We head towards these very deep specialization areas. Even though, as we said earlier, this idea of universal and university experiences. Ancilla, I could have paid you for that thing. We're going to get to Richard Keeling in just a second. We also think about how you're rewarded, right? Let's just think about, for example, in a faculty promotion and tenure opportunity. At least in the United States and most Research One universities, if you have a solo authored article, you are given far more credit towards tenure and promotion than if you have a co-authored piece, right? This idea of collaboration is your co-authorship or connection or partnership somehow diminishes your contribution, right? It's lesser than because somebody else was helping you. So the idea is like, think about what that says about collaboration, and that we wonder why we have people who are territorial owner. Our entire award system is set up that way. Anybody who has sat down and tried to figure out what the order of contributors is going to be on a newsletter, a research article, on a grant proposal, on a report that's submitted upwards, knows that this is difficult, right? It is interesting in the sense that like we somehow or another think about that hierarchy and the idea of sharing, and even if we're sharing and we acknowledge that, where we are in the order becomes so meaningful, right? So when we think about our reward systems, it's really difficult when we think about how we're structured and to facilitate collaboration. And then we have very loosely coupled structures. They're separated and they're not a lot of opportunities. When you think about separate structures, the language, faculty and staff, and the language of the discipline of English or the humanities is very different than the language of engineering and the STEM field. It's like we're speaking different languages. Culture clashes. I saw some of you mention culture. So we have academic and administrative. We have staff subcultures. It's not just the faculty. We like to point our finger at them and say, well, the engineering faculty think they're better than the English faculty. But then we have certain subsidiary groups and staff as well. And the thing is that that's also only with one institution. When you think about the differences across institutions, for any of you who have moved institutional types or even just any institution for a job, you understand that it takes you a good long while just to get to know the lay of the land in a new space. So when we're trying to make change in higher education writ large, it's very difficult when you think about the variation of institutional types, as well as the kind of culture within those institutions. We also are very bureaucratic. Operating principles and policies are different wherever you go. The way the way you submit your form for getting your bursary is different than the way you submit a form for your residence hall, room assignment. And there are different systems for those. Many of you know, and those systems don't often talk to each other. I see that people saying that, yes, support staff versus academic staff. We're not seeing, individuals aren't seen as academics, and of course there are. The idea of being an academic practitioner is huge, but that's like not acknowledged. We don't have the structures or pockets to put them in. And then of course, resources. Resources always divide us, right? Depending on your budget model, you are going to be thinking about us versus them rather than us together. And so these are the things that the literature said. You touched upon many of them. So just to let you know that we are living in a space so it's very difficult for that kind of level of support. And so what this does is it creates these silos when really we need bridges. So when you think about silos, it's this force, this idea of it's centrifugal forces that pull us apart. And the bureaucratic structures, the idea, a fortress of solitude. Yes, good Superman reference, Caroline. But we have these vertical structures in higher education and in the academy that have lived there for a very long time. And you can name them. And I encourage you to think about, sometimes though, we don't see them. We've lived with them for so long, we don't see them. There's a joke, that sometimes if you talk to a fish and you say, oh, the water's cold, the fish will say, what water? Because you live in it. You are spending so much time, you don't see the silos. You don't see how you've become part of a silo and maybe even are reifying that. So I strongly encourage you to think about, if you're going to go towards collaboration, we have to learn and we have to challenge and check ourselves that we aren't part of systems and creating systems that are supporting these divides. What we need to be looking toward are these ideas of horizontal structures. And there are pockets of this in higher education. The one that's most interesting to me that we tend to forget is that curriculum is a horizontal structure, particularly if you're built in a general education model. So for example, if you think about the way a student navigates a curriculum towards a major and degree, it often takes bits and pieces from different places. The idea that you're drawing a process. And by the way, there's some wonderful stuff happening in the chat. The idea of, blended professionals instead of support staff. I think that's brilliant, Mike. Thank you for sharing that. So I do want to say we will capture this chat and get that to you as well. We do have evidence of horizontal structures in higher education that cut across different things. The curriculum is one of them. That's a great example, but so is the first year experience. The thing is that, and this is where we get to Keeling. So thank you so much, Ancilla, for the send up. There's a lot in this slide, so I'm going to let it stay here for a moment. But what you're seeing on the left is the way that horizontal and vertical structures in higher education exist. If you see on the left, those light green vertical bars are the things that have generally been set up in higher education and are supported through resources and bureaucracy and policies to be silos. You see departments, disciplines, schools, divisions, colleges, all those kinds of things. And the language and the way we talk about it, language, reward structures, titles, all support those. But then you see these beautiful kind of horizontal structures that are the blue bars that, that some of them feel kind of sterile, like institutional policy, but institutional policy cuts across all, right? Like that we all have to live by certain institutional policies. But first year experience in transition programs are another very common, very powerful horizontal structure. And you'll see also student engagement and success and student outcomes are the biggest forces that cut across all of these areas. So we have incredible potential to be the bridge, not just to build it, to be it ourselves. When you think about all that goes into a first year experience program, who owns all the pieces that we talked about earlier of advising and first year early alert and first year seminars and orientation, where those live on your campus. If you're running an orientation program and you have different presentations to students, think about all the different people you invite to speak in those panels. Usually faculty, probably somebody from transactional services, like how you sign up for classes or how do you get your bursaries. Maybe somebody from wellness, whether it's the student health center or the student workout, like gym facilities or counseling and support services. You invite people from all over the campus to participate, or you invite their resources to be submitted for presentation orientation or exposure to students. In a first year seminar, often you'll have people come in and speak and talk about that, or you'll have instructors from different pieces of the university. Academic advising is a model usually in the first year that's more universal. We'll have professional or primary role advisors and then move students into faculty advisors. So there's a lot of different things we see. You all have incredible potential, not only to affect the first year, but to shift how higher education does its work. And the coolest part of all this is that we're never probably going to fully get away from the idea of some silos, some vertical structures, but the really exciting stuff happens in the plaid. It happens where the horizontal and vertical structures overlap. And so you'll see this too in this quote from Koo, who's quoting Keeling as well. These principles suggest a need for a level of organization and horizontal integration of services that far exceed traditional cooperation or collaboration and have integration among activities that support learning provided through the institution. So Keeling is the one that really introduced this whole idea of horizontal and vertical structures. So I'm interested to see what you think, and this is going to now go to another poll. And I might have to be walked through how to do this yet again, because this is not the easiest thing. But when you think about your campus, I want you to rate on a scale of 1 to 7 how integrated first year programs are in your campus. Are you the bridge? Are you that horizontal structure? Or is first year experience really quite siloed and a set aside thing? So I'm going to launch a poll and you're going to rate how integrated your first year experience program and programs are in your campus, from not at all, which is 1, to absolutely completely and totally integrated, which is 7. And let's see if I can go ahead and do some polling here. Back to this one. And I'm going to launch this poll and you guys are going to rate yourselves. How integrated are FYE programs on your campus?
There's a comment chat, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you. We see that at specific times, the integration is much higher initially, but then disintegrates as the year continues. I think that's probably fair. While we often talk about the first year experience, quite honestly, we most often are we're front ending it. We front load the first year experience into the first term, or sometimes even in the first 6 weeks. So first year moment, it's true. So I'm going to end the poll, and we see that there are 9 individuals who said they're very integrated. And so I'm thrilled you're here still, and hopefully still learning something. And then we have some that are saying moderate or somewhat. And I appreciate that. I appreciate your honesty here. I want you to go beyond this, though. I think that we've said, I want you now, and I'm going to give you 90 seconds. And me sitting in front of you all for 90 seconds, not saying a word, is actually quite intimidating. But I want you to write why. Maybe like 3 or 5 reasons, or you just want to write like a free write reflection for 90 seconds of why you rated yourself where you did. So I'm going to give you 90 seconds to just reflect for the reason you put that rating.
There's a comment from Bryce, one from Andre.
I'm appreciating that people are sharing their feedback. You are welcome to share that if you would like to. If not, it can just be for you. So that's great. Thank you. Thank you, friends. I appreciate again, you honor me with your honesty and your transparency to sharing this in the chat. If that's not where you want to do that, that's fine. One of the 2 things here I want to say is, I encourage you to interrogate your why, right? To why do you have the belief structure you believe? What are the principles for your operating, assumptions? And the second thing I just want you to walk away with here is the idea of, when was the last time you gave yourself 90 seconds? Even just 90 seconds to sit and reflect. Especially this past 15 months, we have been absolutely killing ourselves to do everything for our students and get all the things done in our lives and our campuses. And I know that you all know the power of reflection for your students, and I just want you at times to give that gift to yourself. So if nothing else, you might have gone, into your phone, or used it as a screen break, or, jumped on your email to answer something real quick. It's a long day, and I get that. But, two lessons from that 90 seconds. One is to interrogate your why, and the other is to start to give yourself the gift and the space of just sitting and reflecting. So if nothing else, I hope if you get nothing else out of the session, I hope you got 90 seconds to reflect. But there's some great, great pieces of feedback, and I'm going to, in this chat, and I'm going to say a couple of them. One is, Bryce, you had a great point that, yes, again, we don't do this for retention, but that's the lever that most people understand, right? Wait, what are you talking about? Our students are staying, they're doing great. It is hard in some senses to tell people why a first year experience is necessary if it kind of ain't broke, and that's really challenging. And then we see Andre talking about it takes place. We often look for the signs of old silos to see if the first year experience is happening. It's more discrete in the beginning and then gets more and more dissolved and diffused into institutional practices. So I think you're right. The idea of it being sort of discrete, and then how do silos show up is important to see how we think about this. I appreciate, Danielle, and this is something I touch upon later, this idea that COVID is probably in a space that has drawn us together. I would also say that as we begin to think about how we integrate some of the things that we've done and the integrating force of COVID, there's a thing called trauma bonding, and we don't necessarily want to take the principles of trauma bonding forward, but maybe we want to unpack the trauma portion and the crisis portion from some of the effectiveness of collaboration. And so there are some incredibly, insightful pieces here to these reflections. And if you, I also see that awareness of on-campus of FYE is high, support services are vocal and visible, first year support services are available to all academics. That's fantastic. I think I want to go, I'm hoping I'm saying this, Zanu, if I'm mispronouncing your name, I do apologize. I want to go work where you work. That'd be amazing, because that's not always the case. Many different programs, and sometimes a disconnect between them. We see that from another colleague. So there's a lot of richness to your reflections, and you honor me with being transparent and sharing those. So thank you for that. you'll see as I share that these are the national data we had. And so while you all were kind of, I would have had it's called a bimodal distribution. You had some at like 4 and then some again at 7 or sorry, 6. This one is really much more of a normal distribution. It is, you see majority of people fall somewhere in the middle. Majority of the institutions that responded fall somewhere in the middle for that first year. And that, you know, from totally decentralized to totally centralized. And that is interesting to note, because I think that it's reflective of the things that you shared, which is sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, it's situational, it's dependent on, oftentimes it's dependent upon people. You might have certain champions that bring people together, but that's not formalized. And then that person leaves and then you're sort of dispersed again. So there are a lot of different forces, and you'll see that it's generally sort of in the middle for most. But I do want to share with you one other thing of why it's so important for us to consider coordination in the first year, because we asked this same question on our national survey of sophomore year initiatives, and the distribution shifted much more towards being decentralized. After that first year, we lose a little bit more and a little bit more for each year of our ability to be centralized. So that first year is so critical that we build a support structure and we build an approach that's integrative and collaborative, because that is the starting point, not just in our relationship with our students, but also in terms of how we continue to support that student. We have this incredibly strong moment. You know, again, remember those horizontal and vertical structures in the plaid. It was those transition programs, the student success programs that show up so much in that first year, that we have an opportunity to affect real change, not just for our students and not just for FYE, but also for the institution overall. I guarantee you, as we see the first year move more and more towards being like centralized and integrated, you're going to start to see the same thing happen in the second year coordination. So there's a real precedent. The other thing I want to say is that there are benefits. You know, if you're trying to sell this to somebody and they're like, well, why bother? There are actually documented benefits. So if you integrate for example, a first year seminar with a course in a learning community, the first and second year retention, value of academic skills, improved academic satisfaction all go up. So there are proven benefits. If you package multiple high impact practices in combination with the first year experience, you get gains in deep learning, general education, practical competence, personal and social development. There are heaps and heaps of evidence and research that show that this really does work. Now, I do want to say, sometimes when I present this, people are like, okay, let's go make 20 high impact practices in the first year experience, 20 initiatives for the first year experience. There's a difference between strategically putting things together and just assaulting students with support structures. So I do want to say that these are all with the assumption that this is strategically created, that you're creating couplings of programs and initiatives that make sense, that are seamless for the student. The other element that is so critical is that as we think about certain populations on our campus, and all of us have this, the populations may differ. Depending on where you are in the world, where you are in your country, where you are in higher education. There are always students that we're concerned about, populations of students that are historically either underrepresented, underserved, or don't perform or aren't as successful in the spaces that we do. And we can address some of that with the things that Bryce was talking about, but we have to address the potential of higher education to gain in equity. And part of that, our ability to be collaborative, shows up, it affects equity. When you strategically couple together first year experience programs with other meaningful educational enterprises within that umbrella, you get larger boosts for students in these kind of lower equity, lower represented, more concerning categories. So there's amazing equity potential in the idea of strategically connecting it, because everybody gains, but students that you're most concerned about, students that are in these populations that need the equity potential, tend to gain even more from these strategic combinations of first year experience programming. And some of that is believed because the wraparound support is more necessary for students who are in these might be challenged in inequitable groups, but for whatever reason, there's some magic happening there. And so you have to, the idea is that integrated coordination does lead to equitable outcomes. It is a tool not just for student success, but it is an institutional success. It's a tool for equity. And you know what, people, we don't get that kind of double dip that often. Usually, if we're advancing equity gains, we're having to make choices. We're having to say, this group gets services and this group doesn't. This, this group that has greater need gets resources, but we have to take away from another group. The idea is a strategic, integrated, collaborative first-year experience program. Almost everybody gains. The worst that happens is a neutral outcome, right? I can live with that. If a small percentage that are getting a neutral outcome and the huge percentage that are getting a high, outcome of student success, outcomes and learning and, connection with the institution and academic success gains and personal success gains, all those things, fantastic. Everybody's getting it, but the students who are in these groups that have equity concerns are gaining even greater. We don't get that kind of gain. So the first year experience, if we do it strategically, is such a powerful tool. It's so powerful, but collaboration is a key to that being those equity gains happening. So again, quoting yourself, so the coordination of first year programs. So this goes back to the idea, this is where the constellation, a true first year experience includes more than just one star program and instead represents a constellation of support. So what does that mean? Remember this list. I shared with you in the beginning all the different percentages of institutions that reported that they had first year programs. This is fantastic. But as I said, you can do all these things and still not get the outcomes of student learning and equity gains because you're doing them in those silos. What we need to do is shift our thinking. And I'm going to ask you to please just take a moment. Literally, I'll give you 30 seconds to go through this and familiarize yourself with the parenthetical abbreviations, because those are going to show up in the next slide. And everyone goes, what does this mean? So I'm going to have you take a look at those and just kind of commit them to some thinking. Some of them are hopefully are logical, first year seminars, FYS, placement testing, PT. Sorry, convocation doesn't have one. It's CNV. It will show up at the next one. Because what we need to do, if we want to think about this as instead of being a star program, any of these can be a star program, but instead a constellation of support, is we have to do this. And what we did at the National Resource Center, being the little math nerd that I am, along with Dallin George Young, who's also at heart a math nerd, we said, we don't just want to know the percentage of institutions who are offering these programs. We want to know how they're being offered together. And so we statistically created a constellation of how programs are offered in the United States under the umbrella of the first year experience. Now, there are some things I want you to notice about this, right? So again, there's a lot here. You see the lines of things those are statistically significant connections between these programs being offered together on a national level. This is the national constellation of the first year experience based upon the results of the 2017 National Survey of First Year Experiences. So one thing you should notice, lots of connections. The other thing you should notice is that there's some little floaters out there with nothing. The other piece of this slide that's really interesting is that, remember, the darker the box, the more prominent it is offered. So what you should be noticing is that the most prominent programs that are offered in the United States tend to be disconnected from the constellation. So if you remember, advising, which is the abbreviation ADV here, was the most prominent first year experience initiative in the United States, most commonly used by far. And it has no statistically significant connections to anything else, which means it is just as likely to be offered on its own as it is to be offered with other things. It's not meeting its full potential. It's not going to gain the full equity and student success outcomes if it is a little floater off on its own in this little universe. I really need to take astronomy so I know what a little floater in an astronomy context means. If somebody is an astronomer and you know what that means, or what that word is, but it's on its own. It's not part of a constellation. You see the same with early alert. Orientation and first year seminars, which are again, very prominent, and not just for us, but you all mentioned orientation, only have a few connections to a few other first year experience programs. So there is a great concern that we are missing the opportunity, space dust, thank you, Carlene, it's space dust. So we are missing the opportunity for us to be as integrative as possible, particularly for our large programs that tend to meet the largest number of students. There are some other things that are interesting to look at here. So all the way in the bottom right, we have these little sort of tinier constellations that aren't as connected. So you see developmental education and placement testing are their own little constellation that aren't connected to something else. To me, I think this represents our need to evolve transactional services like placement testing and like students in developmental education who often live on the outskirts of the curriculum. We're like, oh, well, when you're ready, you can join the rest of us, right? That we have a great potential here for these two that are really connected to move them to a more central position with the rest of the first year experience. We also see on the other side that there's a little bit of sort of sub-constellation of gateway courses, general education, writing, and summer bridge programs. And that makes sense because those tend to be clustered together in these sort of initiatives. So I think what I want to challenge you all with is and you're going to have an activity in just a minute, is to think about this. I saw somebody else have a sidebar with Hansela. You will have these slides available to you so you can spend more time with them. But the truth of the matter is that we are missing some potential to bring particularly very broad-based programs that have a lot of scope on our campus into a more central position. So if I was looking at this and it was reflective of my experience on my program, I'd be like, wow, how do I move advising to a central position where it has meaningful connections to other first year experience programs? So we are going to have you do something right now, and I think you probably see where this is headed. I want you to get a paper, pencil, something that you can document this. It's an activity that you're going to do, because what you're going to do now is you are going to, so get ready, you are going to draw the constellation of first year experience programs for your campus. You are going to select the programs that you mentioned earlier and maybe add some other ones. Put them in a sort of physical visual space of how they're connected. How would you draw the constellation for how are you going to draw the constellation for first year programs? And I think this is a really critical reflective exercise. And I'm going to give you several minutes for this. So please take a pen, paper. If you have some sort of graphic tool on your computer, you can do that tool too, but draw this constellation for yourself. And I'm going to, sort of go silent for about, several minutes and let you do this. And then I'll come back and we can think about it. I am actually for this activity going to go back to this constellation to maybe, you don't have to follow this. In fact, I hope you don't, but to maybe remind you of some of the programs that might exist or how you might connect it. So this is going to stay on the screen. I'm going to go silent for a little bit, let you do your thing, and I will be back. Nope. Sorry. Technical difficulties, sorry. There we go. I am back, so hopefully you can hear me now. So Elizabeth, I just was giving you some space to do work on your constellations. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you, Jennifer.
Great. Okay. I hope that you enjoyed that. And I'm going to ask you, use your Zoom reaction option to tell me how that activity was for you. Like, so if it was so hard, it was okay, it was great, it was excellent. So use your little Zoom reaction button to tell me, communicate with me, and I will scan through. You can tell me. So I see that one person, a couple people are saying that was pretty rough. It was okay. I'm going to give people a chance to give me some other feedback and reactions. This is me trying to be clever with interaction in a virtual space. I also see that somebody has a hand up. So go ahead. I don't know if that's if that hand was to in fact communicate or whatnot, but I appreciate you giving this. Mike, thank you for sharing yours. And if somebody, I'm going to give anybody a chance, either in the chat or if you want to ask to be unmuted with a raised hand, to share why it was hard or why it was okay, or share your experience doing that. Would anybody like? Okay, so Lucy said the challenge of this exercise is that because of the siloed history, there's not information about what others are doing in terms of FYE and how it relates to others in the institution. So really, it sounds like, Lucy, you struggled. You could maybe draw the boxes, but the connections were the part that where you draw the lines between them is where it was maybe tough. Correct me if I'm not doing that well. It looks like there's some other ones. It looks like, Mike added some different ones. I don't recognize some of these, but it looks like librarian was in there. Assessment was in there. Another exciting opportunity for partnership is your assessment offices. So these are some great ways of thinking about it. I hope that drawing your constellation helped you think about it. One of my favorite activities is to go to a campus, work with them, sit with a room full of individuals who are all part of the same first year experience program, ask them each to draw the constellation. Each of them are totally different. So I encourage you, if you have other colleagues that aren't at this conference at your campus, or you want to use this as an exercise, I really encourage you to do that. Have people sit that are part of the same program and really learn how you each are seeing the connections, because some of these things are opportunities. I didn't mean for it to be so sobering. Hopefully it's a starting point. Let's look at this with a growth mindset, right? It's a starting point. There's all sorts, if it was sobering and you're just, instead of thinking of it as discouraging, think of it as your starting point as you move forward. So there's more to think about this. There are two other elements that I'm going to leave you with for reflection in the future. The first is what was there and what wasn't, right? If you were looking at your own constellation, not necessarily in comparison to the ones that I had on the list, what was part of your constellation and what wasn't? Or if you drew it, what were the things that were connected and what was off on its own as a little piece of space dust, or like this little birdie over on the right-hand side? Issues of inclusion and exclusion programmatically are really important to think about, because they might suggest potential partners that haven't been leveraged, or they might suggest sort of institutional silos that you need to break down. That can be person-based or program-based, or it can be structural. And so you need to maybe think about, why does this exist over here? Or why are these three programs space dust? Do they live in the same space on the campus? Are we looking at a systematic silo? Are we looking at individuals maybe who don't know how to be partners with us? So there's some differences there about that. I also, oh my goodness, Carlene, like you and I are the same mindset, because there are other elements you have to interrogate, not just the things, the nodes, but also the nature of the connections, right? So I'm going to make this super complicated by the fact that we talked about, if there's the first one, does a connection exist or not exist, right? Can you draw a connection between two programs? But you also, if you can, have to interrogate what the nature of that connection is. Is it formal or informal? Are those two programs connected because the directors of those two programs have lunch frequently because they're friends? Or are there formalized, resource-based, policy-based reasons that those two programs have a connection? While I do not want to underestimate the power of informal connections as a starting point, we too often build entire programs on informal, weak ties that can be easily dismantled by an individual or a champion, either moving in the institution or moving out of that space. So moving informal connections to formal is important. Moving weak connections to strong connections is really critical. There's a lot of things we do from an operational perspective. That's a good starting point as well. Well, it makes sense for us to collaborate on this. We have similar ideas. Let's connect on this. But move something from being operational to being strategic, that's a pretty big leap, right? Strategically, are we headed towards the same goals? Do we have assessment outcomes? Do we have structures in place? Have we aligned our strategic planning? More than just, hey, it would save us a couple bucks if we did this at the same time, the same way. That's operational versus strategic. And then we have ones that are longstanding versus very recent connections. And this one isn't like sort of bad, good. It's just worthy of note, because longstanding connections aren't always good. Sometimes they can be sort of embedded and become, like, in their own ways, kind of mini silos, like we saw with the developmental education and placement testing. But so we have an opportunity. They're difficult to dismantle if we have longstanding connections that maybe live outside of other pieces of the constellation. So we see that Carlena's time is also a consideration, starting point, pathway, leverage for another. Thank you. Should some even exist? It's important to be strategic, especially with resources and capacity constraints. Absolutely. You want to be, and that's a little bit of the operational versus strategic. Like, is it strategically beneficial for your students, your programs, the institution to have these things connect? Or is it historical legacy? Well, we do this because it's the way we've always done it. We always connect this program with this program because that's the way we've done it. We're in sort of a lifeboat exercise here in life, people, with, you know, in terms of what we have the capacity and resources to do, and we have to make difficult choices. It's time to start thinking and dismantling some of the assumptions we have and really considering that's been operational. We do it because it's always been that way, but is it strategic? So leave it to me to give you even more work, but that's the next stage of this process. Okay, so you're fine. We've talked about, you know, collaboration. We've talked about connection. What do you do to create these things? And I do want to talk about that a little bit. So again, Adriana Kizar has done a lot of work on organizational structures, talks about, you know, redesign. What do campuses that care and collaborate do? And you know, these are some of the characteristics. You know, there's facilitation of dialogue about educational goals and campus leadership. It's very, you know, transparent in that regard. It's a networked environment. The idea of communities of practice and networks are in places and spaces. This idea, again, of staying student-centered, that the student voice is there. It's not just that we're student-centered, there's egalitarian values where students are as important as any other constituency on campus. There's a prioritization to integrate structures, right? You have these opportunities for connecting things. And let me, as an aside, talk about the political reality. Right now, in budget crisis, in resource crisis, in, you know, large-scale COVID crisis, structural integration is often motivated by things like resource scarcity, right? That's a good place to start. Capitalize on the opportunity that people are like, how do we integrate things? How do we find economies because of resources? And then sell people on the idea that not only does this create economy, it creates horizontal structures. So, you know, revising reward structures, having incentives. Andre, you have a perfect one that should be added to this list. And I will tell Adriana that collect, you know, data-centric, data-informed assessment, you know, supported things. I think is another one that campuses that care and collaborate do well. The idea that assessment and data is a part of it. You know, again, we see that they make existing efforts for more tangible, making this more tangible and visible. Oops, sorry. Facilitating learning, and it's a culture shift. You are shifting culture. There is a wonderful movie. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's in the United States. It's one of my favorites. It's called Shawshank Redemption. And it's about two men who, one man who was falsely accused and he was put into prison and he lives there his life sentence. And he's trying to change things. And his mentor in prison says, it's time and pressure, Andy. It's time and pressure. That's what it's all about. And I use it often when I talk about institutional culture. You've got to time and pressure. It is a long game, people. You use leverage points, you use small pressure points, you're patient, and you continue to shape culture. As we saw earlier in the chat, I think it was Andre, but it might have been others, so please excuse me if it's misattributed, attributed. I mean, you know, change in higher education is evolutionary, not revolutionary. But the truth of the matter is this past 15 months is as close to revolutionary change as we're probably ever going to get. And that's out of crisis, which again, we have to make sure we're not making trauma choices, but that we're actually making strategic choices out of this. But it is a culture shift. So time and pressure. So let's talk about some structures. Adriana also offers some structures for collaboration. You know, the idea of creating campus-wide advisory boards or steering committees or cross-functional groups, making those very visible. Establishing partnerships that are either formal or informal, and you want to work to formalize informal connections, right? You don't want something that is created, these collaborations, to become dismantled because somebody leaves, because the champion changes focus. You know, you want them to become formalized, but informal structures, operational structures are a great starting place. Identify those and move them more towards formal and strategic and strong connections. You know, networking programs across academic departments, breaking down these barriers between faculty and staff, or even earlier, as we saw, between staff. You know, we got to stop these kind of ways we continue to perpetuate sort of hierarchies, right? And create different roles, create these sort of hybrid roles of a faculty coordinator, of, I'm forgetting the title that that Mike offered, but something that's a little bit less like academic or support staff. So we have the power of using language to drive the change. Other strategies you'll see here. One of the things I want to say that's really reminiscent of the time we talked is that one of the critical pieces to being able to change things into a collaborative approach is the recognition of first-year experience as a system. It's a system. So whether you look at it as a collaborative, as a constellation, that's a systemic understanding of things. The other one I want to say is that our previous speaker, Bryce Bunting and Alan George Young, who I've cited here, are working on a theory and a model of it based upon a different system called liminal peripheral participation, or legitimate peripheral participation. That's an exciting theoretical approach that looks at the first year experience as a system. And then don't underestimate the power of using these sort of student structures for us. We have launched at the National Resource Center a professional learning community. Our first one is with colleagues at historically Black colleges and universities who are student success professionals. Our next one is going to be with TRIO professionals, which is a prominent program here to advance low-income students of color and first-generation students. Connecting people in learning communities, creating a common reading program. Maybe it's the book that Bryce wrote, I don't know, but maybe that becomes your common reading for your faculty. Take those programs that we use to integrate students and apply them to us as professionals. That really helps. And you see also build on a curriculum model. And another strategy is, as we see more and more technology systems, as you select technology systems, prioritize in your selection process the ability for that to talk across different units and connect other systems. We are basically continuing to purchase systems that live in one silo on the campus rather than purchasing technology systems that have crosswalks and talk to other systems on campus. There's incredible potential and power of using technology as a cross-cutting thing. Historically, technology has been a vertical structure. I see us tipping that and making, and by our selection of good technology that is integrated across, we can make it a horizontal structure. So that's another thing. Some levers for you to pull wherever you live. I think earlier, Ansela, I didn't mean to overlook your question about like agency and hierarchy and what do we do? And I think that I'm really glad I added this slide, which is here are some levers to pull that are relevant wherever you situate yourself in the academy, in the hierarchy, in issues of agency, right? How you brand and identify the institution, how you choose to engage in communication strategies and the language you use that might be more collaborative or connected or less hierarchical. If you can engage in strategic planning and accreditation activities, I don't know, accreditation is something very strong here, but strategic planning activities that prioritize things that are collaborative, because strategic planning sets priorities and values and reward structures. So remember, we said that reward structures tend to look to individual things that are not collaborative. In a strategic planning process, you can start to prioritize things that are collaborative. If we're going to look at collaboration in the first year experience as an equity tool, then we have got to honor that our student populations are changing and bring that up. Understand who we're serving and the fact that equity is no longer something that is an option. It is an imperative, and that something of like collaboration the first year experience is going to help us get to that. Common experiences and outcomes, finances, budgetary efficiencies. Like I said, right now, couple that with crisis. This is a pivotal moment right now for us to move from a siloed to a bridge perspective, because the bridge, the horizontal structures create efficiency, they create communication, and they help us manage crisis. So these are the things. And then again, assessment, incredible opportunities through data. The thing that I want to say about this is that a lot of these forces exist wherever you are. You participate in communication strategies. You participate in assessment. You are living this crisis right now. You are dealing with budgetary efficiencies. Whether you have the control of creating the budget or you're just living in it, but able to create efficiencies, wherever you exist, you have these as levers to pull. And that's the good part. That's why I offer this, because I feel like some people feel like they don't have agency within the organization. I think, Ansela, the second piece of your question was, how do you sell this to up the chain? These are some of the things too. These are some of the tools you can use to sell it up the chain through assessment, through efficiencies, through crisis management, through addressing changing student populations. These are your pressure points, your time and pressure points, right? So I wanted to offer things that are maybe live outside of any kind of hierarchy, but that everybody has some touch point upon. We're almost there, people. These were the session objectives. I really hope that we have been able to address some of these in our time together. I appreciate your engagement in this. And one last chat before we leave. I want you, I don't know if you know much about goal setting, but goal setting says that if you consciously identify a goal, you're much more likely to do it. If you articulate that to another sentient being, whether it be your dog or your cat or whatever, if you think it's one thing. If you articulate it out loud to yourself, that's another level of likelihood that you're going to achieve that goal or do something with it. If you say it to another sentient being, like literally they've done studies that if you say it out loud to your dog, you're much more likely than if you just say it out loud to yourself. But the most powerful thing in terms of responsibility, accountability, and reaching your goals is if you articulate it to other people who can be your professional learning community and your support. So I'm asking you, based upon what we dealt with today, what is just one thing you're going to do with the knowledge you gained in this session? One thing. And if you want to articulate it in the chat, I'd love that. That takes it to the level of your ability to achieve that. If you just want to write it down for yourself, that's fantastic. If you're at home and you want to say it out loud to your dog, that's another one, or cat or something, or even better, a partner or a child or somebody. So if you're willing to share that, I'm going to give you again a minute for that kind of reflection.
Yes, thank you so much. Good afternoon, Jennifer. I think from the knowledge that I've got today, it's whereby somebody can make collaborations so that you do more research, that you grasp better understanding of why are we supposed to implement this program, why certain programs are meant to be implemented, why others cannot be implemented. Because as we have said earlier, there are a lot of challenges in order to implement those challenges. But whatever that we come across, it needs to be researched and being published. So the why should be out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. I'm honored that you shared that.
On the chat.
Excuse me?
There's a couple of comments on the chat as well.
Yes, I'm seeing these as well. Align FYE at your institution, Danielle. I'm assuming that your recently released Vision 2030 is part of your strategic planning, and that's an incredible opportunity to find that space and place. The constellation activity, that's wonderful, and it looks like that's relevant to a couple people to either think through that or share that. Draw university documentation on systems. Yep. These are all wonderful things. I appreciate that.
I'm blown away.
Go ahead, sorry.
I'm blown away by how much we've managed to get through in 90 minutes. We need you, Jennifer.
Have you met me before? Like I said, I talk fast, I pack a lot in. I usually leave people a little bit overwhelmed, but your time is valuable. I'd rather leave you a little overwhelmed than not with enough information. And these slides will be available and you can go back through them at your own pace. And again, please feel free to follow up with me. We don't have much time now for Q&A, but I do want you to feel like you can reach out to me and we can continue to have these conversations.
Well, for those of you who don't know, the material for this workshop, the basis for it is, I think, a month-long course that Jennifer is running online as part of her work with the NRC. So we could consider ourselves very fortunate to have had her condense all of that, sort of 90 minutes.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me here. And I want to be sensitive. It's the end of a long day for all of you. I can stay on for a few extra minutes if you want to chat, but I believe that FYE, be the difference. That's what we're doing. And I think there's a lot of potential for you all to do that in a constellation collaborative approach. And I'm really excited to have talked with you today.
Thank you, Jennifer. Absolutely inspiring and always a pleasure. And as I've said before, there will be something precious for you in the post, and it's a surprise, but it's something that is sparkly.
Ooh, you know me well. So this is lovely. Thank you all.
So I think this main room might possibly close in a few minutes' time. Palesa, you can correct me, but we have the opportunity to chat to Jennifer offline. Or if not, we can all just unmute ourselves and say goodbye to Jennifer and to each other. We'll reconvene tomorrow.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Thank you,
Colleen.
Jennifer.
Thank you, Killa.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
That was a lovely chorus of goodbyes.
The University of Johannesburg. The future reimagined.